Hello everyone and welcome back to another video. This is the fifth episode of the story that tells of what if the second Shinobi world were left destroyed out of fear. Its inhabitants were left slaughtered or scattered. However, what if the members of Uzushio's famed Uzumaki weren't as scattered as people thought? What would it mean for one Uzumaki Naruto? After watching, like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin. Tazuna household. 5 days later, the amount of ribbing Naruto had gotten from Hikari, and later Kiba once he found out, regarding his run-in with the girl boy named Haku in town had been epic in proportions. Kiba, in particular, took great pleasure in occasionally pointing out Tsunami, Hinata, and Kakashi and reminding him of each one's gender. Of course, 2 days after that started, Naruto had trounced him in a spar, and the Inuzuka quickly got the message to let up on the gender jokes. Well, that and the death glare Kumiko had shot him. Beyond that, however, Naruto was happy that he was finally making progress regarding water walking. With his chakra reserves diminished thanks to the shadow clone splitting it up amongst them, he found it was easier to grasp the concept. Even better, his chakra control was starting to not suck something hard. Oh, it was still pretty bad, by all accounts, but at least it wasn't as awful as it had been back during his academy days. But what thrilled him more? He finally got to go back to his team. Satisfied he wouldn't just get knocked out of the fight by being tossed over the bridge, Hikari had greenlit his return to his teammates, prompting a thankful nod from Kakashi and excited reactions from his teammates. While he might not have been the most hands-on teacher in Konoha, Kakashi had disliked having to split up the trio, even if there was good reason for doing so. What Naruto found upon his return, however, was that sparring with Hinata and Kiba was no longer the predictable affair he'd been used to. While they still possessed flaws in their adaptive fighting styles, the two were starting to complement each other quite well. In fact, Naruto had been forced to use his clones more often than not, lest he get overwhelmed by his teammates. Shit, he cursed as he tilted his head away from a clawed strike from Kiba, only to have to jerk his left shoulder back as Hinata shot forward with an open palm, ready to nick him there. He jumped back just in time to avoid Kiba's spinning kick to his head. Crossing his fingers, he smirked. Nice, but let's take this up a notch, yeah? He asked with a grin. Immediately, 2 shadow clones burst into existence at his sides, shooting forward to meet his teammates in battle. Realizing they were about to go on the defensive, Kiba slid into a ready stance, allowing Hinata to move forward and quickly intercept both clones with well-placed palm strikes to their sternum. Immediately thereafter, Kiba smirked at his surprised teammate, crouched down, and dashed right at him, clawed hands at the ready. Right on time for Naruto to smirk in turn. 2 more shadow clones appeared at his sides, and one of them pulled Naruto out of the way as the other spun on his heel, ready to deliver a kick to Kiba's head. The Inuzuka boy seemed momentarily taken off guard by the unconventional tactic, but quickly became calm as he smelled a familiar presence dart right past him. The kicking clone suddenly poofed out of existence as Hinata slammed another palm strike into its side, just before it managed to connect against Kiba. The boy, in turn, used his momentum to roll forward, land in a crouch, and slide tackled the other clone, prompting it to jump. Big mistake. Hinata was on it like white on rice. Shoti, she grunted as the bottom of her palm connected with her crush's clone's chest. Both members of Team Kakashi glanced at each other then, shooting each other satisfied smiles as they succeeded in fighting against their companion. That is, until Kiba was suddenly kneed hard in the stomach by an orange blur from above, and the ground behind Hinata exploded, revealing another clone, who promptly put Hinata into a full Nelson. Holy crap, that was close. Naruto breathed as he continued to hold down Kiba with his knee. He grinned down at Kiba then. Thank Kami you can't count, dog breath. Kiba just flipped him the bird, still too busy trying to breathe normally again to answer vocally. Hinata, for her part, had been so taken aback by the close contact with Naruto that she turned bright red, eeped, then passed out, still held up by clone Naruto's full Nelson. Boss? The clone asked, finding himself suddenly burdened by the dead weight of a fully passed out girl. Little help here? No need. I got her. Naruto looked over and saw Kakashi taking Hinata off of the clone's hands. The cyclopedian Jounin eye smiled at his team. That was a nice spar. Very ingenious way of using your clones, Naruto, he praised before nodding to Kiba. Kiba, you and Hinata did very well, too, but your situational awareness needs more developing. Kiba grunted in acknowledgement as he was helped up by the original Naruto. Ya forgot there were 3 of him in that last run, he admitted. Kakashi smiled as he looked down at the Hyuga heiress in his arms. To be honest, if anyone had been at fault there, it was the girl in his arms. He'd expected her to keep Kiba on his toes regarding the missing third Naruto. After all, she was the more level-headed of the trio. Yet, her satisfaction at being able to hold up against her crush had obviously blinded her to that fact. Plus, what if she had to fight Naruto for real someday? Was she seriously going to pass out every time he made contact with her? It wasn't a career-ending flaw, fortunately just one they'd have to work on if she was going to be the kunoichi he was certain she could be. Oi. One eye. Kakashi frowned as he heard Hikari call out to him from the veranda of Tazuna's house. She was dressed in her shinobi gear, for once, apparently ready to go. The old fart says he's ready to go to work, she informed him as she jutted her thumb back towards the inside of the house, where they could hear an indignant male yelp at her description of the bridge builder. Kakashi nodded at her. All right. Tell him we'll be right there, he requested before turning to his team. With a soft shake, he woke up Hinata, who promptly eeped and jumped away from him in embarrassment, rejoining her teammates in front of him. He held back a chuckle at the sight and placed a hand on his hip and brought out his book, casually opening it with his free hand right at the spot he'd left off. Alright, your teamwork is getting pretty good. Fortunately, it doesn't seem like Zabuza is back in the game just yet, so we'll be practicing some more on the bridge while we perform guard duty to get the kinks out, he informed the kids. Meanwhile, Kimiko-san will be staying here to guard the house, and Hikari-san will be scouting out the town, to make sure Gado's thugs don't come here or the bridge. Any questions? All 3 genin shook their head. Kakashi smiled behind his mask, making sure to keep his visible expression what wasn't covered by his pornographic book completely lazy. Good. Get whatever equipment you think you might need, and meet us at the front door in 5. Understanding the implied dismissal, all 3 genin went indoors, greeting Hikari as they went in. The red-headed girl smiled at all 3 of them before walking over to Kakashi. I left a few warning seals around the perimeter, she informed him, knowing he was listening to her even if wasn't bothering to make eye contact. Kimiko-ne might be almost healed up, but she'll need the forewarning if anything does go down. Kakashi made no motion to indicate he'd even been listening, other than to say, nice call. The 2 weeks we estimated are almost up. I can't imagine Zabuza or Gado, for that matter, letting us run amok for much longer. Hikari nodded, looking serious for once. Kakashi, she said seriously. I know you're one of the top dogs in Konoha, no pun intended, she added as she saw him look amused by that comment, but I'm still with Kimiko-ne about letting Naruto-sama out of our sight. In fact, she's rather pissed at me for letting you take him to the bridge, while I go to the village. Please don't betray my trust. Kakashi tore his gaze from his book to glance at her. I understand, he stated neutrally. Hikari stared right back at him for a moment, seemingly undecided about whether to follow through with the original plan, before sighing and nodding. All right, then. She raised a waiting hand, to his confusion. Your arm. Hand it over. Kakashi frowned at her. What for? He asked, a little wary. Hikari smirked at him. What's the matter? Afraid of little old me? She asked, amused. The Jounin just stared at her silently for a moment before slowly raising his left arm into her grasp. He watched silently as she pulled up his sleeve and placed one hand, palm down, on his forearm, while the other quickly flipped through one-handed seals. His eye widened at the sight. It's not what you think it is, she cut him off suddenly, still flipping through seals before settling on a C-shaped hand sign. Fuin, she whispered, prompting Kakashi to flinch as a strange, spiral-themed seal appeared on his forearm. Letting go, she smiled in satisfaction. What did you do? He asked her as he raised his arm to better check out the seal. He wasn't nearly as familiar with them as his old sensei had been, or the man's wife. It's a distress seal, she told him with a small smile before raising one hand and curling all of her fingers, save for the index and middle fingers. Channel a bit of chakra into your fingers like so, she demonstrated for him before placing them on her shoulder, where her tattoo was. And apply it to the seal. It'll let Kimiko know and I know if you need help. Kakashi nodded, pleasantly surprised by the forethought. That's convenient. What if you need my help? He asked. She smiled. It goes both ways. If I or Kimiko need your help, we'll do the same, but with our tattoos. And suddenly, the Uzumaki were a lot more dangerous in Kakashi's eyes. He'd seen, of course, that all of them had the distinct swirl tattoo, but had chalked it up to little more than a statement of allegiance. Knowing that it also worked in such ways, however, meant they were capable of incredible, non-visual coordination. Used innovatively, it could even be used to send messages in Morse code. Brilliant. Hikari, however, misjudged his careful examination of the seal for something else. Don't worry, she reassured him with a smile. The seal's temporary. It should fade away after a couple of days. A little thankful that she hadn't guessed his actual train of thought, he nodded in thanks. That's convenient, he noted before eyeing her hands. Those hand seals, though, Hikari cocked her head to the side, smiling sheepishly as she glanced away. Yeah, those are special, she said, scratching her cheek. They only work with our Fuinjutsu, but it takes like twice the amount of time to perform because we're only using one hand. Kakashi filed that information away for later perusal. Even if he didn't know much about the sealing arts, he understood well the impact of having the ability to perform one-handed seals. Time lag or not, it was a powerful weapon to have in one's arsenal. Oi! Kakashi-sensei. Kakashi turned to see Kiba waving at him. Glancing back at Hikari, who was stretching out, he nodded at her. Good luck, then, he told her. The red-headed girl smiled gratefully. Thanks. Same to you. In town, a few hours later Hikari groaned lazily as she stretched her limbs, enjoying the light breeze as she lay on some house's roof. A quick tour of the village had revealed nothing unusual, so she decided to take it easy and maybe nap on top one of the houses. Naturally, she'd made sure to set up detection seals in case anyone got too close, but for the most part, she was content knowing that today was turning out to be another lazy day. Honestly, though, she didn't quite understand why Kimiko had been so insistent in patrolling this dump. Sure, the villagers were nice enough when they weren't acting as though she was about to stab them in the throat at any given moment, but for the most part, Gato's thugs seemed content to just strut all over and maybe, occasionally, harass a citizen or two. The one time she'd tried to intervene, she'd been surprised to see the victim take the thug's side, so ever since then, she'd left the situation alone. Clearly the locals seemed to think that causing any trouble would bring down the full might of Gato's wrath on them. It was an eye-opening experience for her. She'd been raised amongst her family, she'd never gone on a mission like this before other than that one time she snuck out and had gone to Konoha, leading to this mess, and so she hadn't any idea that people could just take this sort of abuse lying down. Asking Kakashi, Kimiko, and Tsunami, however, she quickly understood that most people seemed content in remaining alive even if not necessarily free. But thankfully, the past few days had allowed the locals to warm up to her, and she'd more than once been offered an apple or some other food to snack on while she did her rounds. Gato's thugs, for their part, seemed to thin out more and more, until one of the villagers noted that the past few days had been the most calm they'd had in months. The local consensus was that they had been recalled to Gato's headquarters at the wave capital of Hamura. Hikari, for her part, wasn't so convinced, but based on local anecdotes that this wasn't the first time such a thing had happened, decided to trust the villagers within reason. She was Shinobi, after all. Trust, but verify. Still, if it wasn't for the rundown nature of the village, she might have considered it a nice place. Not as nice as Konoha, though. Kami above, that place rocked. Then again, compared to living in an enclosed compound in the middle of nowhere land, anything that approached a semblance of human civilization was a gigantic step up. Not to mention that she could now ogle the male like candy without feeling weird. She smiled in self-satisfaction as she thought to her exploits in Konoha. While Naruto had been out and about doing deer ranks and the Jonin made a game of running their genin's patience into the ground, she'd been enjoying the many wonders that a major village had to offer. And by wonders, she meant the boys, naturally. She'd had a few dates here and there, and while a few ended up being jerks, she'd had a few fun nights. Nothing too adult, of course, but enough to finally feel like she was living gas opposed to just going through the motions back at the compound. It also served as an awesome excuse to get out of the compound construction night shift. Because fuck that. She needed her beauty sleep, and she wasn't going to waste those precious hours working the late shift, just so her cousins to destroy her hard work the next day during one of their overamped play fights. She grinned to herself as she eyed the blue sky above. Yet disobeying Keisuke all those months ago had been the right idea. Finding Naruto was easily one of the best things that had ever happened to her. She giggled as she remembered her promise to the boy, under that starry sky. To pledge her allegiance to him if he broke through to Kimiko. At the time, it had really been something of a desperate gamble, but as she watched the future clan head interact with the cold-hearted clan enforcer, she was easily starting to believe it was just a matter of time. And, to be honest, she was going to pledge herself to him anyway. He had the right heart, she thought, for what was coming his way. Unlike Raiden, whom she shuddered to imagine as clan head, Naruto welcomed any and all into the family. He saw past the divisions that had kept them apart for decades now, and he was determined to see the family reunite, a sentiment not shared by a depressing amount of her cousins. Maybe not the majority, but still no family member should ever not seek the reunion of their family. She bit back a yawn as she enjoyed the warm sunlight, stretching out her limbs again, lest she get so relaxed she'd need a few warm-ups before springing into action. Man, this place was pretty great, calm, peaceful quiet. She frowned. It was pretty quiet. So quiet, in fact, one might have thought there wasn't anyone around. So alert was she at the sudden lack of human activity that the moment her perimeter seals went off, she was already on her feet, hand reaching for her scroll. Right on time, too, as the roof exploded in front of her and behind her, with two shadowed figures popping up, familiar steel, clawed gauntlets at the ready to tear her apart. As she dodged to the side, just in time to avoid getting cut to ribbons, she couldn't help but curse her team's calculations so much for 2 fucking weeks. Yet, as she steadied herself to fight the demon brothers, who were glaring holes into her, she quickly realized their calculations were even further off the moment an arrow whizzed by her head, barely missing her. As she rolled out of the way of a subsequent barrage, cursing under her breath, she managed to get a solid look of the street below. Full of mercenaries. Armed to the teeth with many, sharp objects or bows, all of them looking to severely maim and/or kill her. Fantastic. Tazuna household Kimiko glared up at the ceiling as she lay in her futon, still recovering from her fight against the Kirinin. Well, sort of. While Hikari and Kakashi insisted she still had to rest while her ribs healed, Kimiko was pretty certain she could already function quite well in any sort of standard shinobi scenario. She would only ever really feel the drawback of her injuries, at this point, if she pushed herself too hard. And since Kakashi and Hikari were so willing to take on the Kirinin and his assistant themselves, what were the odds of her having to fight anyone remotely near her level? She sighed, more than a little annoyed at her situation. Doing nothing was proving to be quite taxing on her patience, especially considering what she'd found out during her scouting mission. She could still hardly believe this land had once been the proud and mighty Yuzu no Kuni, home of Yuzushiobikure, village of the powerful Uzumaki clan. This was her home. Or, it had been, once upon a time. In true shinobi fashion, the history of her home had been wiped out from the books, even in Konoha. She'd made sure to raid the village library for any information on Wave Country before the mission had started in order to verify her elder's claims. To her dismay, the books were quite clear Wave had always existed. It and Yuzu had nothing in common. In fact, Yuzu might as well have not existed, but for a few mentions, here and there, about how it used to be allied to Fire Country. But Keisuke would never have lied to her about this. Yuzu, and Yuzushio in particular, were like lost holy sites to the Uzumaki. Everyone with the surname dreamed of the day they could return to their home and reclaim what was theirs. For many of her clanmates, Konoha was but a rest stop while they reunited the clan, with the full intent of leaving someday soon for Yuzu. But aside from the elders, not many were left who could still recall where Yuzushio was, having been born or raised primarily during their time in exile. Like all hidden villages, its location was a jealously guarded secret for all the good that did them the first time around. Even worse, everyone had heard the rumors that Iwa, Kiri, and Kimo hadn't just settled for destroying their village, but had virtually annihilated the entire country. Given the existence of individuals like the Jinchuriki, no one had thought it too far-fetched that their beloved island home was no more. Moreover, their despair at the news was such that no one had the heart to look into it. By the time her generation had come around, no one truly believed there was an Yuzu to go back to, even though the idea of returning one day felt quite romantic. But now she knew their assumptions were wrong. Yuzu had just been replaced with Wave Kiri having installed their own puppet government for a while, before its civil war had prompted it to cut all ties. Now, that decrepit, useless daimyo and his line remained tenuously in power, and Wave was just an accepted fact of reality. And that just pissed her off. She allowed her companions to believe she was pissed off at the villagers' reluctance to stand up to Gato. In truth, she was, but the main source of her rage was that these once proud citizens of Yuzu had so casually tossed aside their history. They accepted Wave as their country, even though Kiri wasn't around to enforce the usurper daimyo's political power anymore. More importantly, they had failed to honor her ancestors. Her parents. The Uzumaki had stood guard over Yuzu since a little after the death of the Rikudo Sennin. Where the Senju and Uchiha had inherited the sage's martial skills, the Uzumaki had focused on his message of learning, and had been amongst the greatest scholars of the age. From Yuzu, they guarded the sage's legacy of learning, slowly building up a reputation for literacy and martial prowess even before the Senju and Uchiha had managed to found Konohagakure. Yuzushio had already existed, even if back then it was just a small, academic town, as opposed to a hidden village. For years, Yuzushio and the Uzumaki had given their all in defending Yuzu's citizens from the ambitions of the larger nations. For years, they'd bled and died in Yuzu's name. All of that swept under the rug. If boiling blood through anger was an actual thing, Kimiko was certain it would have best described her current state as she grit her teeth, feeling every sliver of anger and resentment flood her psyche. Had it been shame that had caused the world to forget Yuzu? Was it treachery? Or cowardice? It didn't matter to her. All she knew was that her family had been relegated to being a footnote in history. A footnote to the lesser clans. She grit her teeth as she felt her chakra flare, sending waves of pain all throughout her body as her abilities threatened to tear their way out of her. With great effort, she was able to reel her temper back, lest it literally kill her in a fit of rage. She needed an outlet. Soon. Between the elders' refusal to criticize the Jonin sensei openly, the revelation about Wave, and her former country's dilapidated state, frankly, if she didn't get her hands on someone to kill soon, she was likely to snap. That was why, the moment she heard Tsunami's horrified scream, Kimiko was torn between smiling outright or just going on her well-deserved, well-repressed rampage. She chose the latter. Wave Bridge Naruto wasn't going to lie, this was not what he'd been expecting to find when his team and Tazuna came back their break. Standing before his team, plus Tazuna, were Zabuza and his masked companion, and right in front of them were a line of hapless workers, all of them looking terrified out of their minds. Each of them had their hands bound behind their back and were forced to kneel, pretty openly outlining the scenario for Team Kakashi. Hostage situation. Huh, he heard Kakashi grunt, apparently just as surprised by this turn of events as he was. Much as I'd love a straight-up rematch against you and that red-headed bitch, Hatake, Zabuza spoke up then, his voice somehow defying physics as it was heard clearly and unmuffled through the mask just like Kakashi. I'm afraid my contractor's patience has run out. He wants Tazuna dead, and I'm not fond of sticking around in one place for too long. So here's how it's going to work. The missing Nin casually reached up to his sword handle and hefted it up, and then set it against the first hostage's throat, a slightly obese, short man. You hand over the old man, and I don't make Fatty here shorter than he already is. Hero. Tazuna cried out, aghast at his subordinate's situation. Tazuna-san, the hostage, now identified as Hero, wept. Please, Naruto glared at Zabuza. This was one of the lowest moves a shinobi could pull off. Even though they weren't samurai, taking hostages was pretty damned cowardly. Apparently, his sensei felt the same way, because when he spoke up, his voice was tight and controlled. I never imagined you for hostage-taking, Zabuza, Kakashi said evenly as he reached up for his headband and slowly dragged it up, revealing his Sharingan eye. I would have thought one of the 7 swordsmen would have had more honor. Zabuza scoffed, though from his companion's body language, it was pretty clear that the younger shinobi felt a little conflicted by the situation. Even so, they were making an excellent show of controlling their emotions. Why? Because we like straight-up fights, he asked archly. Just because we're damn good at kenjutsu doesn't mean we're not shinobi, Hatake, so don't play all high and mighty with me. Zabuza withdrew the blade and pointed it at Kakashi, yet his other hand remained on the hostage's jaw, ready to snap his neck in an instant if Kakashi got cute. I ain't samurai, and neither are you. You think I don't know you've had to do worse? He asked, amused. Or that you're just stalling me so you can figure a way to get around this little setup of mine? Kakashi's eyes widened, and he raised a halting hand. Zabuza, why? Snap! Hinata screamed in horror as the first hostage slumped to the ground, his neck broken. Kiba and Naruto swore loudly as they saw Zabuza brutally execute the man, not even glancing at his victim before his sword swung horizontally and stopped just in front of the second hostage's neck, who looked about ready to pass out. Tazuna, for his part, just stared dumbly at where his subordinate's body lay, his expression frozen in terror. He couldn't even say anything as Zabuza's companion quickly gathered up the corpse and flung it over the side of the bridge, soon out of sight. Pathetic, Zabuza spat as he observed the genin's reactions. Always knew you Konoha hippies were too soft. Can't even watch an execution without going all emotional. Naruto growled angrily as he made a move to dash at Zabuza, only to be held back by the scruff of his shirt by Kakashi. Alongside him, he saw Kiba similarly halted, and both boys turned to glare at their sensei. That look ended just as quickly, however, as Kakashi's glare towards Zabuza intensified. Clearly, the Jonin was not pleased. That was unnecessary, Zabuza, Kakashi stated as calmly as he could. Zabuza chortled at the Jonin's words. Unnecessary? He asked eventually as his laughter came back under control, still sounding quite amused. I have 10 hostages, Hatake, he glanced to the side and then shrugged. Well, 9 now. Killed one to prove I was serious. 9 more to go. As long as I still have one last hostage, you're pretty much going to have to do what I say if you want to avoid more bloodshed. And then the corners of Zabuza's eyes crinkled in mirth. Or tell you what. You do the shinobi thing and let me kill these people. Save your client, he noted wryly. And then we'll have our rematch. Kakashi's glare remained steady, but his hands did not. Making a show of crossing his arms to think this through, he surreptitiously charged his index and middle finger with chakra and placed it right on top of Hikari's emergency seal. Even if he could deal with Zabuza and maybe his companion, the hostage dimension meant he needed backup, fast. That both Uzumaki women were also knowledgeable in seals, particularly of the restraining type, was also rather critical to his plans. Unfortunately, the moment he sent his message, he got one right back. Kakashi did a great job of suppressing a frown. Who had that been? Hikari? Kimiko? Logical deduction told him the likely candidate was Hikari. Kimiko would have likely needed to be on the verge of death before asking for help. And even then, it wasn't a guarantee. Either way, this was problematic. His instincts were screaming at him that they were being attacked on all fronts, and Zabuza, as he had gloated, definitely held the advantage right now, even if perhaps not in the way the man thought. Time to change that. Fine, he stated at last. Everyone on the bridge snapped their gaze over to Kakashi. Do it, Zabuza. Kill them. For once, the swordsman seemed at a loss at this sudden turn of events. He'd been sure that the infamous copy ninja would hold out a lot longer. Long enough, he'd hoped that his backup plans would be in place. This was much too soon. Even so, his bluff had been called, and now he either delivered, or he pussed out. No-brainer. Ignoring the old bridge builder and the genin protesting loudly against this decision, Zabuza gave a grunt as he spun on his heel, grabbed Kobikurabocho with both hands, and swung it horizontally, slicing through each of the 9 remaining hostages' necks as he spun into range. Amidst the startled, horrified cries of his opponents, Kakashi alone seemed unfazed by what had just happened. And then the hostages burst into water. Zabuza was silent as he straightened up, his blade resting about an inch above ground. Then, slowly, he turned his head to meet Kakashi's calm gaze. Clever, he conceded. How'd you know? Kakashi lazily pointed at the masked shinobi, who'd remained still throughout everything, seemingly uncaring about everything that had gone down. He threw the body over the rails. Zabuza chuckled at that. Of course. Nothing gets past Sharingan no Kakashi, huh? He mused. Kakashi shrugged. Exactly. Just like you two are also water clones, most likely, he somewhat bluffed, much to his team's surprise. All 3 snapped their gazes back to Zabuza, who laughed. Kakashi had nailed it in one. Fortunately, no one had to know that his conclusions were more based on deduction and factual extrapolation, rather than concrete fact. In other words, that he'd pretty much pulled that analysis out of his ass. The swordsman of the hidden mist cocked his head to the side with an amused glare. Well done, Hatake, he praised. But if we're not here, then where are we? He asked archly. Naruto didn't like the sound of that. Not at all. And with good reason, too, because at that moment, the bridge under their feet decided to shake like crazy, just as the rather loud sound of something getting atomized reached their ears. Moments later, as he and his team, plus Tazuna, were sailing upwards into the sky, the remains of the bridge and copious amounts of fire racing up towards them, Naruto could only wonder how the hell they'd gotten so shafted in this one mission. In town, 15 minutes earlier sometimes, Hikari really wished she wasn't as adventurous as she was. That way, she could have just stayed back at the clan compound and let some other schmuck take care of bodyguarding duty while she kicked back and relaxed in her new home. She cocked her head to the side, gritting her teeth as another arrow nicked her cheek. Oh, and also so she could stop getting in these sorts of situations. Payback's going to be a bitch, one of the demon brothers snarled at her as he lunged forward, clawed gauntlet ready to tear her to ribbons. Hikari rolled her eyes as she continued to dodge, unable to find a good opening to open her summoning scroll and really let loose on these assholes. But no, instead, she had to play keep away while her opponents failed at making witty repart. Not that it would have improved her situation overall much, but at least it might have been a little more entertaining. Another arrow whizzed by, reminding her to pay attention to her surroundings, or else she was going to be another name carved into the memorial tablet. And to be honest, she was rather looking forward to being one of the few on there that died of natural causes, as opposed to hundreds of sharp, deadly implements. In hindsight, perhaps becoming a shinobi had been a poor career choice. She jumped back, crossing the brief gap between houses and landing on another roof, only to jump back as the other half of the demon brothers crashed right where she'd landed, his gauntlet making short work of that section of the house's roof. "That's not nice," she noted wryly. "These poor people work hard keeping their roofs looking like crap." "Still making jokes, bitch," growled the second of the pair as his comrade joined him. "Once we get our hands on you, you'll be needing a closed casket funeral." Hikari shrugged. "Beats needing to use a mask to hide your face every second of every day," she pointed out with a smirk. The two brothers seemed a little confused by that, though, so she sighed and put her hands on her hips akimbo. "You're ugly," she deadpanned. There it was. Both Missing Nin growled angrily and charged at her, unaware that their momentary lapse had bought Hikari the time she needed. With a smirk, she channeled her chakra into her hands. "Fuin," she shouted. She knew it was bad form to do so, but her uncle Hiroki had long ago taught her that sometimes, shouting out your technique was a good way to make your opponent hesitate from time to time, especially if it was a technique or jutsu branch they were unfamiliar with. Fortunately for her, the demon brothers were hardly Fuinjutsu specialists, or well versed in the ability of seals. As such, both of them halted their charge and split up to hit her flanks, just in time for Hikari's barrier seals to activate. She grinned as two half-circle purple barriers burst out of the ground, at a radius of about 4 feet, and connected to each other, keeping her for all intents and purposes quite trapped. Or, perceived differently, keeping her enemies at bay while she regrouped. Grabbing hold of her scroll, she set it on the ground beside her and smirked at her opponents as they tried, ineffectively, to break the barrier through brute force. "Should have taken me down when you could, boys," she taunted as she quickly flipped through one-handed seals. "You're about to see why the Uzumaki are not to be trifled with." Just as the barrier fell, she crouched down and slammed her free hand onto the ground, a slew of illegible sealing characters spreading out from the point of impact. "Kuchios," she cried out, prompting both demon brothers to jump back, knowing that summons weren't foes to be toyed with. Hikari smirked. "Wrong move, punks," she taunted, before crying out, "Soar. Sora, show." The demon brothers cringed as shrill, piercing shrieks tore through the air, sounding remarkably like eagles. Both demon brothers reeled as giant eagles rose out of the obligatory smoke caused by the summoning technique, batting their enormous wings as they gained altitude. Briefly, both Missing Nin were able to glimpse the red-headed woman standing atop the larger of the two. The mercenaries, for their part, were stunned at the sight of the two colossal birds, hovering high up in the sky. Only their archers seemed to regain any sense quickly, and resumed fire, now intent on bringing down the eagles. Rather ineffectively, too, considering that the birds had made sure to stay beyond their range, and if a lucky shot did manage to reach them, they would just effortlessly dodge to one side or another. A few bolts were even caught by the eagles in their beaks or claws, and promptly snapped in half. Even so, the arrows were no joke. She couldn't very well ask her summons to suicide charge dozens of archers. Fortunately, she didn't have to. "Sora, show, let's teach these guys who rules the sky," she instructed. Both eagles shrieked in agreement as they began to flap their wings at the mercenaries below, unleashing gusts of winds to rival Futon Futen. While that was worrisome in itself, the mercenaries quickly found themselves about to face a new horror as Hikari stood on her eagle's head and flipped through various hand seals before stopping at Tora. Both demon brothers hadn't been Missing Nin for nothing, however, and quickly realized her intent. As Hikari took a deep breath, the former Kiri Shinobi quickly dashed away. "Katan Karyu Enden." She split her focus between holding up the technique and breathing out the steady jet of blazing fire, spurred on to become a great blaze as it interacted with her summon's powerful wing flaps. She heard the mercenaries scream in terror as her fire hit the ground, incinerating her foes. As they began to run away, she nudged Sora forward with her feet, which the eagle gladly obliged. Swooping down towards the enemy, Hikari kept her footing steady with chakra and continued to blaze a trail up the street, catching most of the mercenaries in her technique. When the few mercenaries who'd survived came out of hiding, trying to shoot Sora in the back as she raced by, Sho would then dive bomb them and crush the life out of them with his claws. By the time Hikari and her summons had finished their run down the street, most of the mercenary group which had tried to take her down were now simply charred husks, crumpled on the ground. The demon brothers, she was displeased to note, were nowhere to be seen. As Sora hovered over the ruined street, Hikari took note that a few houses seemed to have had their roofs set on fire by her technique, despite her best attempts at keeping the collateral damage to a minimum. Thankfully, she had a solution for that. Grabbing her scroll, she unrolled it until about a foot in and took aim at the street down below. "Another run, Sora," she instructed. As the eagle complied, Hikari grinned as she channeled her chakra into the scroll. "Kai," she called out as they began their run, unleashing a torrent of water onto the dilapidated houses. Instantly, most of the fires went out, but she could also hear the indignant squawks of tenants being drenched. Hikari snorted. If they were willing to let her get blindsided the way she had been, they deserved getting a little wet. As they finished up and returned to the skies, however, Hikari winced as she felt her tattoo pulse. Setting her scroll back onto her back, she quickly identified the rookie-like signal as Kakashi's. Its pulse had been weak and somewhat erratic. As she readied to go help, however, she was surprised when she then felt another pulse, prompting a chill down her spine. Kimiko was in trouble. Tazuna's house. Kimiko didn't know where things had gone so wrong. At first, things were quite straightforward. Upon hearing Tsunami scream, she dashed out of her room, still in nothing but her yukata, and burst into the living room, where two mercenaries had apparently taken Tsunami hostage and were now threatening her son, who looked about ready to soil his pants from fear. Pathetic. Being run-of-the-mill scumbags, Kimiko managed to dispatch both with laughable ease. A quick elbow to the throat of the one holding Tsunami hostage and a roundhouse kick to his partner's head, and both mercenaries were on the ground, very, very dead. Ignoring Tsunami's thanks, and not even sparing her son a glance, she turned to return to her room to dress up when she suddenly found herself unable to move. In fact, so sudden was her stop that she almost fell over, managing instead to land on her hands. This afforded her a good look at her feet, which she only belatedly realized were now frozen solid. A quick glance at Tsunami and her son revealed that they, too, had fallen prey to the sudden sprout of ice at their lower limbs. How the hell had she missed that? Trying to break the ice through sheer force of will and brute strength didn't work either, despite pulling at her feet or punching the ice. Then again, with Inari crying in fear again and Tsunami trying her best to calm him down without also succumbing to a panic attack, Kimiko had to admit that her focus was somewhat split. But then things got worse. Without any warning, a hail of Senbon tore through the door, and while she managed to duck out of the way, she winced as a few managed to strike home and buried themselves in her right arm. "Nice work, Haku." Kimiko's glare returned full force as she recognized that voice. There was no way she'd ever forget it. It was the voice of a man she so desperately wanted to kill. "Zabuza," she growled fiercely as she watched the door get sliced into tiny pieces by the Kubikiribocho, revealing, indeed, both Zabuza and his masked assistant, now revealed as a youth called Haku. "Fancy meeting you here, redhead," Zabuza greeted her, his eyes narrowed in a way that told her he was probably smirking under those facial bandages. "Looks like your intel was solid, Haku." The man's assistant merely nodded as he moved forward, toward Tsunami and her son. "As we agreed, Zabuza-san, I will take charge of these two," the quite feminine voice much to Kimiko's surprise spoke up then. Zabuza snorted as he shouldered his legendary blade. "You've always been soft, Haku," he noted. "But fine. All I really want is this bitch anyway." Ignoring Tsunami and her son's cries for help, Kimiko glared over her shoulder at Zabuza. "Coward," she spat. "Not man enough to fight me head-on, you try a sneak attack." Zabuza actually laughed uproariously at that. "And why shouldn't I?" he asked, once he got his laughter under control. though he was still chuckling every so often. I'm Shinobi, just like you. I know my odds of winning are shit if you, Kakashi, and the other bitch are around. And my crew sure as hell can't fight all three of you at the same time. So why not divide and conquer? He then turned to Haku, a little annoyed at the woman and her son screaming. Haku, just finish it, already, he growled. The masked shinobi had been trying to calm down both of his targets, assuring them that they were not his or Zabuza's targets, and all would be well if they just stayed put. For obvious reasons, however, that just wasn't flying. Turning his head back to meet Zabuza's gaze, the masked shinobi quietly stared at him before slumping his shoulders and looking back at Tsunami and the boy. I apologize, the feminine-sounding shinobi said as he flipped through hand seals. You will not die, but you will be unable to intervene. Rest easy, he comforted them. Hayatan Hayaro no Jutsu. In an instant, both mother and son were encased in solid ice from head to toe. Zabuza scoffed. He never could manage to get rid of Haku's dislike for killing. Were it not for that, his companion would have been an excellent shinobi, per his estimation. Turning his gaze back to the bent-over redhead, okay, so maybe they were enemies, but sweet gods of perversion, he felt a pang of disappointment as she managed to straighten up, robbing him of his delightful view. Release me, Zabuza, she ordered him, still glaring hatefully. I'll gladly give you the fight you're looking for. Zabuza was tempted to take her up on that, but he knew that would be highly unwise. Even with her right arm pretty much skewered, he had no doubts that this was a formidable fighter, and he needed to be in top shape to take down Kakashi. Maybe the other redhead, too, if the demon brothers failed him again. I think not, he stated simply before turning away. Haku. Hi, Zabuza-san, the feminine voice answered as more hand seals were made. My apologies, Shinobi-san, but you are a threat to Zabuza-san's dreams. Sleep, the shinobi apologized before finishing his seals. Hayatan Hayohari. Kimiko growled impotently as she watched numerous, thin icicles form out of thin air, all of them poised to run her through. Well, if either of them thought she was going to just lie down and take this, they were damn wrong. In the blink of an eye, she bit into her left thumb and reached for her chest, much to Haku and Zabuza's surprise. Haku. Zabuza barked, not willing to give the woman enough time to bring out another one of her toys. Farewell, Shinobi-san, the feminine companion said as he motioned for the icicles to shoot forward. For Kimiko, it all happened in slow motion. Her thumb was reaching her chest, bleeding as needed, and she was just about to show these punks a lesson in pain when the first shot of pain raced through her body. Then another. And another. And another. She jerked about as Haku's icicles pierced her all over, gasping in pain each time. The pain was immeasurable. It was all she could do not to pass out as she remained standing only by virtue of whatever strength was left in her legs, her body looking like a pincushion, no doubt. She wanted to drop to her knees, but knew her frozen feet would not allow her. Most likely, she knew she would fall forward or backward enough for the icicles to hit ground, then either they would get pushed out or would hold her up. Neither was exactly pleasant to ponder. As she dimly heard her attackers talk, she shakily tried to retain feeling in her right hand. If she passed out now, Naruto and Hikari would be in danger, especially since they likely weren't aware of this sneak attack. Once she heard the two ex-Kiri shinobi leave, she tried to raise her hand to her left shoulder, and gathered as much chakra as she could. She had to warn them. She had to. Even if it was the last thing she ever did, her duty as an Uzumaki was to warn her family of the attack. To her relief, she managed to reach her shoulder, and felt her tattoo absorb her chakra, letting loose the warning signal. Satisfied, she let the encroaching darkness take her, and her hands fell limply at her sides. Shit, 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 shit. Hikari's thoughts were racing as she urged Sora to fly faster towards Tazuna's house, Sho having been redirected to help Kakashi and his team. She had no idea what kind of trouble Kimiko had found herself in, but man, if it made Kimiko use the transponder seal, what kind of odds did she have? The redhead bit at her thumbnail as she fretted over their situation. She knew Kakashi had requested for backup as well, which meant Naruto was, by consequence, in danger, but she was certain that whatever they were facing, it would be best if their strongest backup, Kimiko, was present. She was sure Kimiko would thoroughly disagree and later beat her to a pulp for ignoring a call for aid from their future clan head's teacher. Of course, that implied that Kimiko survived whatever horror had befallen her. And, as she neared the bridge builder's house, a chill went down her spine as she surveyed the shattered front door. Hopping off, she landed softly in a squat, ready to draw her scroll and lay a beatdown if needed, before widening her eyes in shock as she observed the ruined interior of Tazuna's home. Still standing, pierced all over by melting icicles, was her clansman. The bridge builder's family stood nearby, still frozen in place. Immediately, Hikari's thoughts went to her adopted clansman, Yuki. This scenery had all the telltale signs of Hayaton being used, but as far as she knew, Yuki had been the last survivor of that cursed clan from Kiri. Or so their investigation had concluded before her Aunt Nana adopted the boy into the clan. But if the scenery before her said anything, it was that their conclusions were dead wrong. There was another Hayaton user out in the wild, and this one was most definitely not on their side. Dashing forward, she ignored the fallen bodies of the two mercenaries Kimiko had obviously dispatched with relative ease, judging from their wounds. Standing by Kimiko's erect body, she went for one of the icicles to pull it out before stopping herself. There was no way of knowing whether that would help, or just hurt Kimiko even more. Worse, the icicles were melting, so there was a high probability that if she tried to pull at one, it could break and shards would make her wounds worse. Plan B it was, then. Eyes narrowed, she concentrated her chakra control and flipped through the appropriate hand seals, ending on Tora. Holding one hand in a half-tube shape in front of her mouth, she blew softly and allowed her elemental chakra to take the form of a soft plume of flame, making sure to aim it right above the icicles so as to not disturb their position. Thankfully, it seemed that the chakra enhancement in the ice had faded away, as she saw her flames have immediate effect on the icicles. Even as she started to feel her sandals get wet from the accumulated ice, she continued carefully melting of the icicles, only stopping once she was done and Kimiko began swaying from the sudden loss of impaled objects. Grabbing onto her collapsing clansman, she swore as she watched even her frozen wounds thaw, meaning Kimiko would soon be losing a lot of blood if she didn't find a way to fix her. "Don't take Sora," they said, she grumbled as she lay Kimiko on the ground, having also melted the ice encasing her feet. "Why would you need a medic on a C rank?" they said. Unraveling her scroll of seals, she quickly checked for the medical section and frowned. All of the seals she had at her disposal required substantial concentration and a lot of chakra. She wasn't too worried about the former, but she had just summoned two giant eagles and come out relatively unscathed from a fight. Would it be wise to drain her reserves even further before going out to meet Zabuza and his minion in battle? Gah. Screw it. Biting her inner cheek in frustration, she ran her hands through the hand seals described by the scroll, focused her chakra, and lay her hands on Kimiko's broken body. "Kami, this is going to suck." "Chiyu Fuin," she mumbled, before wincing as she felt her chakra start draining at a rather alarming rate. "Oh, Sora's going to kick my ass after this one," she groaned as she kept her focus on pouring her chakra into Kimiko. The regeneration seal was, in truth, the Uzumaki clan's answer to having a limited amount of medics in their family. It worked by incorporating a conversion seal that took the user's chakra and converted it into healing chakra, which theoretically meant anyone could become a field medic. With one little okay, so maybe not so little drawback, it drained chakra like a bitch. Grossly inefficient, the regeneration seal did its job as advertised, but the conversion rate was abysmal, practically 4 units of regular chakra for 1 unit of healing chakra. Which, of course, meant that anyone with less than Kakashi level reserves was pretty much screwed, because they'd be fully drained before they got more than a decent wound healed. Fortunately, the Uzumaki had never been known for having small reserves. Hikari watched, sweating bullets as she felt her chakra drain, as Kimiko's injury slowly closed up. Even her feet, which had turned frostbite purple, had regained its normal coloring as Hikari's sacrificed chakra worked its magic. Each gaping hole had begun to restitch itself, and she could see muscle and tissue slowly regenerate. Good thing, too, because at this rate, she was sure she'd pass out before Kimiko was back in fighting shape. That was why, upon seeing Kimiko's eyelids flutter open, followed by a well-deserved groan, Hikari was glad to finally cut off the technique. As she'd feared, she was way outside combat readiness now. If she tried to go after Zabuza and his masked minion, she was sure she'd be easily swatted aside. Of course, any relief she felt summarily evaporated when she noticed Kimiko's eyes sharpening, then mold into a glare directed at her. Where is Naruto-sama? Oh. Right. Kimiko's whole protect Naruto or die trying thing. Suddenly, facing Zabuza and his skilled subordinates didn't seem quite as suicidal. Not when compared to facing a pissed-off Kimiko. No. Wait. Maybe if she explained her reasoning, her cousin wouldn't fly off the handle and murder her for leaving the future clan head in danger, while rescuing her own hide. I said, Kimiko repeated slowly, sounding more dangerous with every syllable. Where is Naruto? Sama? Or not? Refusing to make eye contact, Hikari just looked over at the destroyed doorway and quietly cursed not having been given the sweet excuse of being encased in ice at the moment, much like Tsunami and Inari were. At least then, Kimiko wouldn't have a chance to severely maim her. Well, she started, swallowing deeply in mounting fear. Maybe he's on the bridge. And maybe Kakashi sent a warning beacon. And maybe Zabuza and his minion are probably giving them trouble, she ventured. And maybe I came here instead because I thought they could handle it and you were in trouble? Hikari could only wonder how on earth she suddenly found herself nursing an aching stomach as Kimiko towered over her, her clenched fist raised in her expression, enraged. Clearly, Hikari had miscalculated regarding her cousin's reaction to being saved. You did what? Kimiko hissed furiously. Naruto-sama is our top priority, Hikari, she snapped at the younger girl. Our lives are meaningless beside his safety. What on earth were you thinking? Hikari said nothing, knowing that even if she insisted she did it because she couldn't stand the idea of Kimiko dying, the older girl wouldn't understand. Or rather, she'd bury whatever gratitude she really felt and would lash out. Like right now, in fact. She braved the older girl's glare as Kimiko obviously struggled to keep her fury in check. She watched as Kimiko checked her body for wounds, or scars, and frowned upon not seeing any. You used the regeneration seal, didn't you? Kimiko asked softly. Hikari nodded, wincing as her stomach flared up from Kimiko's punch. How combat ready are you? I'd be in the way, Hikari answered honestly. Even if Kimiko hadn't punched her, the assessment would have stayed the same, really. After all, the regeneration seal had taken a lot out of her. In hindsight, she probably should have packed a few soldier pills. Kimiko frowned at her, before nodding. Understood. Stay here with Tazuna's family, she ordered before glaring at her again. And don't think our conversation here isn't over, Hikari. We will speak of your dereliction of duty once Naruto-sama is safe. Hikari didn't doubt that for a moment. The older girl would likely see her reported before the elders, no doubt in search of corporeal punishment for having allowed the future clan head go off on his own, so to speak. Any resentment she might have felt over that realization was tempered by pity, however. While Kimiko was right to demand punishment for leaving the clan head to his devices in a crisis situation, it was also proof of Kimiko's lack of trust in said boy. She watched silently as Kimiko dashed out of the house, chakra enhancing her leg muscles to allow her to move faster, even as a large explosion rocked the area. Hikari winced as she dragged herself over Tsunami and Inari's frozen selves and slowly went through the necessary hand seals. That hadn't sounded good, and knowing Kimiko, this would just infuriate her even further. As she breathed fire once more, this time seeking to defrost their unfortunate hosts, Hikari silently prayed that nothing else would go wrong. Fat fucking chance. At the bridge, Naruto swore to himself as he slowly regained consciousness and began getting up. Loose debris and dust fell off him as he did so, only slightly aware that he'd fortunately landed on what seemed to be a broken piece of the bridge's main structure, now half lodged in the water. Wincing as daylight assaulted his eyes, he raised his arm protectively, trying to clear his sight and regain some measure of situational awareness. Had Zabuza died in the explosion? Had Tazuna? A chill went down his spine. Had his team? As though he'd been suddenly bathed in frigid water, he felt reality snap into focus as he realized the ongoing danger he and his team were in. He might have liked to play fast and loose back in Konoha because it was fun, but even he knew when to get himself into gear. Admittedly, somewhat because Takeshi had worked his ass over trying to literally pound some discipline into his head. Filial beatings aside, Naruto quickly scanned his immediate area for any signs of his team or the enemy. Or Tazuna. Couldn't forget the reason they were here either. His quick observation confirmed one thing for him: the bridge was, for most intents and purposes, still intact. Only the most recent construction had been damaged by the explosion, due to the load-bearing beams not having been constructed for the most recent stretch. The rest of the bridge, on the other hand, had merely suffered a few chunks of broken road or other, similar superficial damage. Naruto had to hand it to the old man: he definitely knew his craft. Regrettably, however, he noticed that the section of the bridge he'd landed on wasn't too big, and the floating debris all around told him the blast radius was substantial enough to warrant some concern for his friends and sensei. He could only hope that they hadn't fallen into the water unconscious. Taking a deep breath, he was about to shout for the others when a hand grasped at his ankle. Jumping in surprise, he spun on his heel, hand reaching for a kunai, when he stopped, mid-action, seeing Kakashi lying on the floor, one finger over his mask in the universal shush gesture. Crouching next to his team leader, Naruto quickly scanned his superior's body for any apparent wounds, which the Cyclopedian ninja quickly noted. "I'm fine," the man stated briefly, wincing a little as he dragged himself into a seating position. "A few scratches and bruises." "Where's Kiba?" "Hinata-chan?" Naruto asked quickly, taking his sensei's word for it. Kakashi glanced around, his nose twitching a little under his mask. "Kinda like he was smelling." He followed Kakashi's gaze as the Jounin turned to look at a pile of debris and pointed. "Kiba and Hinata are over there," he said, subtly wincing as he got up. "Help me get them out." It never occurred to Naruto to ask why Kakashi needed his help after all. The man was a Jounin, and a little debris clearing should have been a cinch. In this chaotic situation, however, Naruto had opted for a simple, do-as-ordered mentality. As predicted, both of his genin comrades were under a pile of rubble, with Kiba having lain on top of Hinata to protect her from as much of it as possible, much to the Inuzuka boy's credit. Seeing them motionless, however, made Naruto feel like his stomach had bottomed out, though this was quickly alleviated when Kakashi pronounced them both unconscious, rather than dead. Dragging them out from under the rubble, Naruto and Kakashi let them lie side by side as they took stock of the situation. Tazuna was still missing, for one, and the missing Nin were nowhere to be seen. Typically, this would have made the perfect instance for them to attack, which was why this sudden peace and calm was so unusual. "Something's wrong," the future Uzumaki clan head said seriously. Kakashi nodded, pleased to see that his student had caught on to the severity of the situation. "Yeah. You were up before me. Did you see Tazuna by any chance?" he asked. Naruto shook his head, starting to make his shadow clone hand seal. "I could comb the area, though," he suggested, the technique on the tip of his tongue. Kakashi, however, shot that down with a quick shake of his head. "Save the chakra," he ordered. "Zabuza and his subordinate are probably somewhere around here, still. We can't afford to waste chakra while they're on the prowl." "Then how are we finding the old man?" Naruto asked, rather stubbornly. Now that his teammates were out of immediate danger, his altruistic mind had reverted to concern for the old bridge builder. He'd be lying if he didn't feel some admiration for the civilian, who despite a lack of any martial skill, had opted to defy a man with a small army at his disposal. Kakashi glanced around with his visible eye before sighing. Well, let's think about this, he told Naruto calmly. Think if we can't see Tazuna, what's the most likely scenario? He asked. Naruto scrunched his face, a little annoyed at the idea of sitting around and talking the problem out instead of initiating a widespread manhunt. He's in the water, he offered. Kakashi shrugged. That's the most basic answer, sure, he conceded. But think deeper. Zabuza needs proof, probably, that he killed the bridge builder. Gado's not the kind to just take a missing nin's word for it, he noted absently as he looked down at his two injured genin. So even if he fell into the water, Zabuza would have him, most likely. Naruto's head fell as he curled his hands into fists at his sides. So failed? He asked, dejectedly. Kakashi eyed him for a moment silently before turning his attention back to the genin. Hikari-san and Kamiko-san didn't show up when I sent the signal, so they're probably under attack, too, he remarked. Kiba and Hinata are in no shape to travel, and even if I could fight Zabuza and his subordinate at the same time, if Gado and his mooks are around, it might be too much even for me, he analyzed, subtly putting a hand on his left thigh. While he'd made a big show of being fine for Naruto, the truth was that he'd felt something tear there, and fighting while having his mobility compromised was a fool's gambit. He sighed as he stared back at the half-finished bridge. It might be best if we went back to Konoha, he admitted truthfully. It would have been the sound, strategic thing to do. Had any other team gotten this mission, he had no doubts they would have packed up long ago and called it quits. That his team had managed to come even this far spoke highly of their skills, but reality was a harsh mistress, and the good guys didn't always get to win. Unfortunately, said considerations meant nothing in the face of Naruto's unbridled optimism and selfless sense of duty. Like hell, the blonde shouted angrily, punching his open palm. We promised Tazuna we'd help him. We can't just pack up and leave him to get killed. Kakashi sighed. He'd had a feeling his loud-mouthed student wouldn't give up so easily, however much he'd hoped otherwise. Naruto, getting your teammates to safety is our first and foremost duty, he reminded his charge sternly. I appreciate we gave Tazuna-san our word, but we've been outmaneuvered this time. There's no shame in admitting defeat. He winced internally. His old self would have vehemently disagreed with that statement, particularly considering the circumstances that led to his father's suicide. Even so, he had to make Naruto understand that living to fight another day was a valid strategy. Especially when one's comrades were on the line. Naruto, however, was obviously torn by his sensei's statement. On the one hand, he did want to go and take his friends to safety. There was no telling what other traps Zabuza had planned ahead with, and he knew he'd never forgive himself if something horrible happened to either of them. On the other hand, he'd wanted to prove to Inari and the people of Wave that standing up and fighting back wasn't an impossibility. Would he really return to Konoha with his words meaning nothing? His gaze went from his friends to the bridge, then back. Meanwhile, Kakashi sat silently by his unconscious students, knowing he could just take the choice out of Naruto's hands with a simple order. However, he really wanted for the blonde to make his own mind. This was an impossible choice, he knew, and there was no better moment to make Naruto grow up a little by forcing him to choose between two morally ambiguous choices. Even so, he couldn't help but feel some anticipation grow inside him as he saw Naruto sigh and open his mouth to answer. Would he choose his teammates? His mission? These were the sorts of decisions that defined Shinobi. Naruto-sama. Kakashi winced a little when he heard Kamiko approach, the redhead landing close by, a fierce gaze in her eyes. Unlike when they'd left her, she was now garbed in her usual Yoroi armor, looking ready for battle. This was, of course, rather confusing to both males, as she'd been still recovering from her wounds when they left her. Kimiko-ne. Naruto cried out, surprised, while Kakashi merely observed her silently. No limps, no Winsesh was completely healed up. He knew for a fact that she hadn't been overstating the damage done to her body by her fight with Zabuza, so how had she recovered so quickly? I'm glad to see you alright, Naruto-sama, she stated flatly as she glanced over to Kakashi and the fallen genin. It seems you alone came out unscathed. She actually sounded pleased at that. I just heal quickly, Naruto said, before turning to Kakashi. Now that Kimiko-ne is here, we can go after Tazuna, right? He asked excitedly. Kakashi frowned as he realized the boy was right. With Kimiko on hand, and apparently fully healed, they actually had a chance to defeat Zabuza and his minions. Between him and Kimiko, he was sure they could fight off the missing Nin, while Naruto escorted his friends back to the house. Where's Hikari-san? He asked Kimiko instead, buying himself some time to think. Recovering, Kimiko answered tersely. She utilized a dangerous technique to allow me to recover from my wounds. After Zabuza and his subordinate ambushed me, she explained. Undoubtedly, she is seeing to the bridge builder's family as well. Kakashi nodded, feeling a little relieved. If Hikari was back at the house, then they had someone at least at Chunin level around to protect the kids. Especially if he sent back a soldier pill. Alright, then we should split up, he stated decisively, making Naruto grin. Kimiko and I will go after Tazuna while you, no. Kimiko's flat interjection completely cut off Kakashi mid-plan, prompting both conscious males to snap their heads in her direction. Unapologetic, the woman crossed her arms over her armor and stared them both down. This mission has gone on far enough, she stated sternly. Hataki, you put Naruto-sama in enormous, unwarranted danger with just seeing this mission through to the end, and Naruto-sama, you do not have the skill to fight Zabuza or his subordinate. You cannot be so reckless with your life, she chastised the blonde. We can't just leave Tazuna behind like that. Naruto protested vehemently, sweeping his hand out angrily. We promised to help him. That is irrelevant, Kimiko replied, frowning. Naruto-sama, your life is worth more to the clan than the old man's. It is my duty to protect you, even if it means taking you back kicking and screaming. Kakashi eyed the two Uzumaki clansmen warily, wisely deciding not to intervene in this conversation, which seemed a long time coming. Clearly, there was more at hand than met the eye. Like hell, Kimiko. Naruto snapped, dropping the honorific as his temper began to flare. I don't care what it takes, I am not leaving these people behind when I can help. His cousin's frown turned into a glare as she stepped up to him and stared him down. These people are ungrateful wretches, Naruto-sama, she snapped right back. Content to live off of Gado scraps, so long as their miserable lives are left alone. They do not deserve your pity. And so, what? Just because you don't like them, we run? Her future clan head challenged her. What happens the next time we come across someone who needs help? Do we just abandon them, too? If it saves your life, yes. Then I'd rather die. Naruto yelled at her, shocking his cousin as his irises briefly flashed red. Even Kakashi, who'd been content with just standing by, was immediately ready to subdue his student as he felt a brief flare of the Kyuubi's chakra. Naruto-sama, she asked, still a little shocked at his vehemence. Said blonde was breathing heavily, adrenaline pumping through his system. I only know a little about what happened to you, Kimiko-ne, so even though I don't know all the details, I get it, he said through gritted teeth before grabbing hold of one of her armor's plates and pulling her to him, glaring right up at her. You got hurt. People are trash. Yada, yada, yada. Get over it. This time, it was the redhead's turn to flare up, but she was just as quickly shut down when Naruto tugged on her armor again, signifying he wasn't done. In all likelihood, the only reason he wasn't unconscious and hanging off her shoulder by this point was the sheer ballsiness of his actions. You think you're the only one in the clan who suffered? He asked her angrily. What about Gigi? He saw thousands of us die. What about Oba-chan? She was right there with him. Even that asshole, Raiden, lost his dad. Hikarinne doesn't even remember her parents all that well, and neither Natsu or Takashi do, either. But they still laugh, he continued, tugging again at his cousin's armor, his gaze fixed on her blank stare. They still live. They still trust. And you know what? Despite all the crap you put them all through, they all still love you, Kimiko-ne, he added fiercely. She glared at him. I don't need your, shut up, he cut her off again. Kakashi could see her fists tightening, undoubtedly restraining herself from inflicting great bodily harm on her future clan head. Honestly, he was torn between admiration and frustration at his student's nerve. Lesser men would have just caved in at the redhead's first glare and left it at that. But not Naruto, apparently. I don't care if you want our love or needed your family, damn it, the blonde stated fiercely. And I heard the stories about Yuzushio. We didn't just abandon people because it was inconvenient. We prided ourselves on doing the right thing, he reminded her. So tell me, Kimiko-ne, how is leaving doing the right thing? You are my future clan head, I must protect you above all else, she stated neutrally, still unbowed. Naruto stared her down for a moment, then let go of her armor and turned away from her, taking a few steps towards the rest of the bridge. He only spared Kakashi a glance. Kakashi-sensei, I'm sorry, but even if taking Hinata-chan and Kiba back to the house is the right thing to do as shinobi and as a friend, leaving Tazuna to Gato isn't the right thing to do as people, he said as he crossed his fingers in a familiar seal. I'll make a few clones to help take them back to the house, but I'm going after Tazuna, even if I have to do it alone. Kakashi eyed his students back silently marveling at his student's decision. Had this been his answer to his previous question, he wondered? It was almost remarkable how like his father he'd turned out, if so. Kakashi, those who stray from the path of justice have no courage, but under the wing of a strong leader, cowardice cannot survive, he mumbled to himself, remembering his old sensei's adage. Sighing, he got up, wincing a little at his aching hip, and put a hand on Naruto's shoulder. Don't tire yourself out, Naruto. Let's take Hinata and Kiba back to the house, then go after Tazuna. Hataki. Kimiko snapped, unappreciative of his willingness to enable Naruto. I thought you said he was in danger of being killed. Naruto asked his teacher suspiciously, ignoring his cousin's protest. Kakashi gave him a simple eye smile. Oh, he still is, he acknowledged. But Gato's the sort of scum that likes putting on a big show. Tazuna told me the last time he had his hands on a rebel like him, he had the man tortured in the main plaza. Trust me, Naruto. We've got enough time. Hataki, I will not let you take him there. Kimiko interjected then, thumb already bleeding and ready to summon a weapon. Kakashi frowned at the younger woman, but other than a slight tensing of his muscles, he made no move to prepare for a fight. Nor did he have to, as his soul-conscious student got in between him and Kimiko. Kimiko-ne, the boy said seriously, no longer staring at her with anger in his eyes, only steeled will. I get that the clan's hopes are riding on me. Don't think I don't, he told her. But if being clan head means being a coward who abandons people when they need him the most, then I want no part of it. Kimiko goggled at him, speechless. Naruto took the opportunity to jump away, landing roughly on top of the ocean water and running back towards Tazuna's home, two shadow clones behind him, each one carrying one of his injured teammates. Kakashi, meanwhile, spared his fellow Konohanin a pitying glance. Someone I knew once told me, he said. Those who don't follow the rules are trash, but those who abandon their teammates are even worse than trash. Kimiko grunted absently as she looked away, clearly torn by her charge's unwillingness to drop the mission cold. Naruto reminds me of him, Kakashi plowed on, unfazed by her disinterest. He's a little rough around the edges, and maybe he could stop to think things through a little more often, but he's a good person, and a fair one. Aren't those the most important traits for a clan head to have? He asked rhetorically, before following after his student via Shunshin. Kimiko was left there, standing in the midst of the ruined portion of the bridge. She angled her head upwards, looking up at the shining sun, reflecting on what just happened. And for the first time in so many years, she actually began to doubt herself. Tazuna's house, you're sure about this? Hikari asked cautiously as she felt her chakra return full force, thanks to Kakashi's graciously offered soldier pill. Do we have a choice? Kakashi asked right back as he finished dressing his hip wound. Zabuza covered his bases. Even though most of us are fine, he's made it abundantly apparent that underpowering even one of our fronts will result in another ambush. This is the most logical choice. Which means Zabuza will be expecting it, Hikari pointed out archly. You're hurt, Kakashi, and no offense to Naruto-sama, but Zabuza's direct subordinate is no slouch. Whoever he was, he managed to take down Kimiko-ne, and that's no easy feat even if she was injured. Fortunately for us, Naruto doesn't have to fight Zabuza's henchman for long. I just need him occupied while I take down my target. Kakashi said as he curled his hands into fists and spread them out again, stretching his fingers out. If he had to resort to that technique, it always helped to keep one's fingers nimble. Hikari sighed explosively as she rubbed the bridge of her nose. This mission had gotten all fucked up remarkably fast. In fact, in all her days as a shinobi, she'd never seen a situation escalate quite so quickly. Not even in the stories her relatives told her about their careers. In hindsight, they were probably whitewashing their experiences to cut out the mood killers. Figures. Kakashi-sensei. Both shinobi turned to see Naruto coming down the stairs, grim-faced. How are they? Kakashi asked him simply. Sleeping it off, Naruto reported, smiling at his cousin as she patted him comfortingly on the head. Hey, Hikari-ne. I heard you kicked ass. Hikari smirked. Damn right I did. Ain't that easy to take down a summoner, you know. Naruto snorted before looking at Kakashi. I'm ready, sensei, he said determinedly. Personally, Kakashi somewhat doubted that, but at the same time, he figured Naruto was as close to ready as he ever would. If nothing else, his fighting spirit was at an all-time high. The Cyclopedian ninja nodded. All right. Let's head off, then. He ordered as he turned to leave the house. Hikari-san, I'm counting on you to look after my students. The redhead nodded silently as she watched the man leave the house, followed closely by Naruto. However, before he was able to leave outright, she quickly closed the distance between them and hugged him tight from behind, surprising him. Hikari-ne? He asked, stunned. Stay safe, Naruto-sama, she told him softly. I heard about what you said to Kimiko, she added, making him tense. Please, stay safe. Our clan needs you. Please don't take that hope away from us. Naruto's gaze became downcast as he listened to his older cousin become uncharacteristically solemn. And the truth of it was, he knew she was right. Even if he'd mouthed off to Kimiko about not becoming clan head or whatever, he knew he couldn't just rob his family of the possibility of reunification. He wasn't that heartless. I will, Hikari-ne, he promised, before following after Kakashi. Hikari sighed, placing a palm on her cheek, as she watched both of them disappear out of sight, undoubtedly ready to inflict great bodily harm on those who'd hurt their comrades and threatened the freedoms of an entire country. Heroic, really. Yet, not for the first time, she somewhat wished someone else had taken on this mission and handled the situation. While she was much more willing to give Naruto some breathing room to grow as shinobi, she had no doubts that more than a few dissenting voices would make her life hard once they got back, and by consequence, Naruto's. Well, if there was one good thing that could possibly come out from this messed up situation, it was that someone had actually stood up to Kimiko, for once. Even Raiden might appreciate the guts it took to do that. They're going to die. Ah, yes. The other pain in her ass. As expected, Inari was standing at the foot of the stairs, glaring at her. His run-in with Zabuza and his ice-wielding minion hadn't done the boy's pessimism any favors. If anything, it seemed to become even more entrenched. Frankly, she was starting to regret defrosting the little brat. Unfortunately, Tsunami went into shock soon after being rescued, due to the news Kakashi brought that her father had been taken by Zabuza. Poor woman. Hikari couldn't blame her for taking the news badly. First she'd lost two husbands, now her father. Kami, it was like the universe adored using her as its own karmic punching bag. What this unfortunate turn of events also meant, however, was that there no longer was anyone keeping Inari's belly aching in check. Shouldn't you be at your mother's side? Hikari asked calmly as she kept her watch on the doorway. She really didn't want to turn to face the kid, not trusting herself not to throttle him at this point. The boy said nothing at first, making her hope that he decided to leave this as a one-off. Said hope was quickly dashed. You should have just stayed away, Inari said accusingly. Now Grandpa's going to die, and Mom is going to cry, and everything's going to get worse. His voice rose as his steps grew closer. No doubt he felt braver talking to a person's back than to their face. Your grandfather would have been dead if we hadn't come. Hikari pointed out simply. You don't know that. Inari snapped. He could have just given up. He could have left Gato alone. No one wins against him. Why did you have to come here and mess up our lives? Hikari closed her eyes and mentally started counting. Elder Keisuke had always told her to try the method out whenever she felt her temper might get out of control. Hopefully, Inari would see her non-responsiveness and take the hint to leave her alone. No such luck. At least they'll die with Grandpa, Inari said nastily. Maybe then you outsiders will learn. 9-10 Nope. In a flash, Hikari had Inari by the front of his shirt and off the floor, hanging a good 3 feet off the ground as she glared fiercely at the child. It wasn't in her nature to take out her anger on children, but this one had insisted on pushing her buttons and wishing ill on the very people who wanted to save his grandfather. Just pissed her off. Listen here, brat, she said icily. You're going to shut up, now, and you're going to go back up to your mother's room and keep her company. Because that's what good little sons do. Understood? You won't hurt me, Inari said defiantly. Strange, how the boy's courage seemed to pick the dumbest moment to surface. Hikari's glare never lessened. You're right, I won't. I don't waste my time on trash, she spat at him, the venom in her words making him wince. You think you've had it rough? Give me a break. By the time I was your age, I already knew how to kill a man, because otherwise our clan's enemies would kill me. She drew him closer, still scowling at him. I've watched uncles, aunts, and cousins die before I was even 10 years old. Kimiko-ne watched her parents get killed. Naruto-sama was alone and shunned by everyone until we found him and brought him back to the clan. Your misery wouldn't measure up to an hour of our lives, she continued, before dropping Inari and glaring down at him. You ask me, maybe the one who should have died in Kaiza-san's place should have been you, she added, ignoring the pooling tears in his eyes. Your mother and grandfather told us all about him. How he was a courageous man. How he fought for what was right. A real man. Fat load of good that did him. Inari snapped back. He's dead. Gato killed him like he was nothing. In an instant, Hikari was crouched at eye level with him and poked him in the chest, hard, keeping her finger firmly planted into his chest. Or did he go to die so Gato wouldn't kill you, brat? She asked. Inari reeled back at the question. Wah. Do you know how your grandpa convinced us to help? She asked him sternly, frowning as she watched him shake his head. Figures. You just judged us as optimistic idiots, right? Thought we were heading in blind? Here's a news flash, Kiddo Kakashi and most of the team were all for leaving you cold, she told the child bluntly. Your grandpa convinced us otherwise by pointing out that if we didn't help him, Gato would likely kill all 3 of you, just to make sure there were no loose ends. Shock, followed by growing fear, creeped up on Inari's face as he realized where Hikari was going with this. Kaiza probably gave himself up for you, Hikari finished, getting back up and rubbing the back of her head. To be honest, most of her anger had been rather transient. As much as the kid's words pissed her off, it wasn't anything she wasn't already used to, taking care of most of the orphans in the Uzumaki clan. Gato probably threatened you all, and Kaiza probably traded his life for yours. Now that's a real man. Hikari had always found it strange that a man like Kaiza had been so easily taken down. The more she'd thought about it, however, the more she began to see a recurring theme in Gato's way of doing things. A little digging also revealed that Kaiza wasn't just executed on a whim. From what she'd gathered, he'd been heading a local effort to overthrow Gato. After more direct efforts to silence the man failed, Gato had undoubtedly used the threat against his family to have the would-be rebel give himself up. A pattern now repeated with Tazuna. Otherwise, why would Gato have sent the two mercenaries here? Fortunately, they'd managed to deflect that particular move of his this time around, and since Zabuza and his minion hadn't taken the old man's family, that meant they were probably kept in the dark about this. She frowned. Why would Gato keep his own minions in the dark? There was no logical reason for it, and it could have complicated things for Zabuza had Kimiko not taken care of them already by the time he'd shown up. She frowned deeper. Something wasn't adding up. Why would Gato keep his hired goons in the dark? The reason for such secrecy usually relied on instances of operational efficiency, but there had been none in this case. Unless... She scowled. Of course. That fat, little... What's wrong? Inari asked, sniffling. Hikari blinked, having utterly forgotten she was still in the company of the world's whiniest problem child. Still, her words seemed to have had some effect on him, because that utterly defeated look had fled his visage. Inari, she stated seriously as she glanced at the stairs that would lead to the room holding Kakashi's genin and Tsunami. Is there anyone left in this village who would stand up to Gato? She asked. Inari looked away. Hikari had figured as much. She bit her nail. Damn it, she growled. Kakashi wasn't familiar with the Uzumaki signaling system, having avoided using Morse code in the event that their tattoo seal fell into enemy hands, and there was no telling what Kimiko was up to right now. Is Grandpa in danger? The boy asked. Obviously, he probably meant more danger, but Hikari let that slide. If Gato's the little shit I think he is, then yeah, Hikari stated tersely. Damn it, and I can't leave Kakashi's genin here alone. Engrossed in her thoughts, she never noticed that Inari had quickly sped out of the house. Village Square. Tazuna began to sweat profusely as he was dragged forward by Zabuza, his hands bound and his clothes torn by the bridge explosion. As heartbreaking as it had been to watch his hard work be damaged like that, he'd had to quickly reevaluate his priorities as Zabuza captured him and soon brought him to the village square, whose history he was intimately familiar with. It was the very same place Kaiza had died. And, predictable as always, Gato was standing there, clad in his usual, overpriced kimono and haori, with two mercenaries that Tazuna didn't quite recognize. They certainly weren't the goons Gato had normally used for protection. Goodness, they'd even re-erected a cross in the middle of the square, where Tazuna had no doubt his punishment would be inflicted. As brutal and imaginative as tyrants were, Tazuna couldn't help but feel that once they found their preferred method of hurting people, they became quite predictable. Not that it made his current predicament any more tolerable. Tazuna, 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 Gato greeted him condescendingly as he approached, his equally overpriced cane tapping against the dusty ground. You should have listened to me, bridge builder. You should have sold when you had the chance. Tazuna glared. Of course Gato had offered a good deal of money for the right to use the bridge exclusively, as part of his ongoing campaign to turn Wave into his personal playground. Tazuna had, of course, refused as much as his family could have used the money. He hated Gato not just for the cruelty he'd inflicted on the island and his family, but for being a traitor amongst traitors. Like Tazuna, Gato was a native of Wave, and Tazuna had known him when they were both much younger. Gato had always had dreams of making it big, and for a while, the residents of Wave had been glad to see a son of the battered island kingdom succeed. And then he'd come back. Gato had changed. He wasn't a young man with big dreams anymore. He was now an unscrupulous trader, willing to barter and trade in everything that could make a pretty penny, no matter how illegal or immoral it was. He went from being a source of pride to a source of shame and anger. Even the daimyo, to whom Gato had once paid homage as all good citizens did, was now firmly within Gato's pocket, living off what little revenue Gato allowed the government to receive. The neighbors who'd once known Gato in his youth now regretted not drowning him when they'd had the chance. Either way, Tazuna smirked at Gato's provocation. He knew he was about to die, but if that was to be his fate, he was going to make sure he went down swinging. Why? The way I see it, I go down a hero, and you go down a super jackass, the bridge builder jibed, only to wheeze painfully as one of Gato's mercenaries planted his fist in his gut. Disrespectful of your betters as always, Tazuna, Gato sniffed derisively. No matter. You won't be shooting your mouth off for much longer. He nodded to his bodyguards, who moved forward to take custody of the old man. Only, they never got there, as Zabuza's gigantic blade suddenly swung down and blocked their way. Gato, however, was unfazed. He had a feeling about why this was happening. Is something the matter, Zabuza? The masked shinobi just glared at the short man. I'm not some Turio hack, Gato. You want the old man? Pay up. Now. Gato faced down the taller man with a glare, but then shrugged and motioned to his minions. Hand it over, he said. The two mercenaries exchanged a look before one of them went to the post and brought back a smallish case, which he opened before Zabuza, revealing neat stacks of currency notes. The missing nin arched an eyebrow at the unusual method of payment. While it wasn't rare, by any means, paper currency wasn't widely used outside the 5 great nations, mostly due to the fact that the minor nations usually couldn't back up their notes' worth with hard currency. He frowned as he spotted the note's backing stamp, the symbol denoting which country the notes were issued and were legal tender in. These had the kanji for water, meaning if he wanted to trade them in for hard cash, he would need to revisit his old stomping grounds, as the other nations were understandably quite reluctant to accept foreign notes. Unlike the metal coinage seen throughout the continent, which held a rather steady value over time, currency notes were notorious for being easily valued and devalued according to their country's current economic situation. Of course, returning to Mizu would just mean playing right into Kurigakure's hands. Which he was sure Gato knew. Crafty little troll. He made a mental note to himself to check the slips once they were out of wave. Currency notes were also notorious for being easy to forge. Couldn't find a less dangerous place for me to cash in, Gato? Zabuza grouched as he handed the now closed case to Haku. The businessman chuckled. It was one of those laughs that just grated on people's nerves, causing Zabuza to tighten his hold on Kubikura Bocho's handle. Mizu's banking laws are less strict, Gato replied after getting his chuckle back under control. He then nodded to his mercenaries, who stepped forward to retrieve Tazuna. Now, hand over my old friend here. Zabuza eyed the old bridge builder, a flash of pity crossing his gaze, before shrugging and shoving him forward into the awaiting hands of Gato's mercenaries. Tough luck, old man. Should have just moved away. Even as Tazuna felt the two mercenaries drag him towards his inevitable doom, he decided not to let his captor have the last word. Glancing over his shoulder at the two missing nins, he gave them a pitying look. A man with no home would never understand, he said simply as he was dragged to the post. Well said, Gramps. Once again, Tazuna found his imminent doom suddenly aborted. This time, however, there was no gigantic blade to impede his killer's path, but rather two yellow blurs on either side of him right as Gato's flunky's head snapped forward, having been simultaneously kicked in the back of the head. Falling forward onto his knees, having suddenly lost the mercenary's steadying grasp, Tazuna looked back to see the blonde brat from a ninja team he'd hired standing there, 2 identical copies at his sides. Gato reeled from the sudden intrusion. What? He cried out, surprised, as he took a few steps back. His head quickly turned to face Zabuza, who seemed surprised as well. Zabuza, we had a deal. Why are there still Konoha shinobi here? Zabuza grunted, the only overt show of surprise he gave off. He obviously hadn't expected anyone to survive the bridge explosion. Still, if it was just a genin said thought was quickly debunked the moment he felt something sharp start stabbing into his back, prompting an instinctive kawarimi. Reappearing nearby, he growled as he saw Kakashi standing there, the tip of the man's kunai dripping with his blood. Not one to be slow on the uptake, Haku was soon by his side, having dodged a slash from the cyclopedian shinobi. Should have checked for bodies, Zabuza, Kakashi said as he joined his reckless student in standing guard over Tazuna. The blood on his kunai glistened as he raised in it a defensive stance. Naruto followed up by punching his fist into an open palm, a fierce grin on his face. Now, we're going to kick your ass. Konoha, Fire Country, how do you think they're doing? Shikamaru repressed a sigh of frustration as Ino voiced the question for the millionth time since they got back from their assignments and found out that the only team that hadn't arrived back was Kakashi's. That had been a week ago, and he would have been lying if he said he wasn't somewhat worried as well. Asuma and Kurenai had done a good job at keeping their body language neutral, but Shikamaru had been perceptive enough to note a few anxious tells. Clearly, something had gone wrong. Yet, for whatever reason, no backup team had been sent. Knowing he would have no way to help his friends, then, Shikamaru dove into the one hobby he had that allowed him to push aside all his worries, shogi. To his amusement, Asuma had refused to play him this time around, as he always lost to the teen. Instead, he was using Sasuke as an acceptable replacement. The boy wasn't nearly on his level, but he was skilled enough to make Shikamaru pause every now and then. Unfortunately, whenever Ino got on one of her worry benders, she managed to completely suck in his attention by repeating the question over and over until he gave in and answered. Hey, Shika, what if something happened to them? Case in point. They're fine, Ino, he told her flatly as he moved a piece on the board, prompting a frown from the class prodigy. Asuma and Kurenai don't seem too worried. Why should we? He lied smoothly. He knew neither jounin were anywhere near relaxed about Team Kakashi's absence, but why stoke that fire? Maybe they're lying. He would have called the comment perceptive if he hadn't known Ino any better. She was reaching now, letting her imagination run wild in the absence of information. It came with the territory of being a giant gossip. He watched Sasuke grunt absently at the comment, then slide a piece across the board. Shikamaru raised an eyebrow. A gutsy move. Unfortunately for his classmate, also well within his expectations. He pushed his piece and swiftly rendered Sasuke's move ineffective, prompting a scowl from the Uchiha. Even if they were, there's nothing we could do about it, he then told Ino, well aware that he was testing her patience with his preternatural calm. If Kakashi and his team need help, they'll send in the cavalry. No use fretting about it. He could practically feel Ino's heated glare. Likewise, he noticed Sasuke's lips pursing ever so slightly, and a few looks of disapproval from his other classmates. They're your friends, too, Shika. Ino reproached him. As much as they frustrated the life out of him, Shikamaru agreed with that assertion. Despite all the crap Kiba, Hinata, and Naruto put him through, testing his patience and whatnot, he was still quite fond of them. What Ino and the others failed to realize, however, was that having a genius intellect, Shikamaru had already gone through every stage of worry possible. At night, he would draw up contingency plans, ran through scenarios, pondered a visit to the Hokage to get some answers. And just as quickly, his prodigious intellect would remind him how ineffective all of that effort was. So what if he could run scenarios and assign probabilities? His dad had probably preempted him already. So what if he knew how best to solve every scenario he'd imagined? The Hokage had probably already thought about it first. He was still just 12 years old, however mature he might be thanks to his shinobi upbringing. His voice, hierarchically speaking, was insignificant. The others would understand that, eventually. That's why I have faith in them, he told Ino instead, loud enough for the others in their group to hear him. He dearly wished Asuma and Kurenai would restart their training sessions, instead of putting them on standby, in case Team Kakashi needed backup at any given moment. All this inaction was making his group way too jumpy for his peace of mind. Whatever's happened, they're a team who'll be able to pull through. Sasuke grunted again, though he seemed a little reluctant to do so. Apparently, the Uchiha heir agreed. Whatever happens, they've got a good queen to deal with the unexpected. Sasuke noted. Kakashi? Sakura asked, as she edged closer to the game, her classmates emulating her as the group converged to discuss the issue. It took a moment for Choji to realize that Sasuke had spoken in shogi metaphors. Shikamaru smiled to himself as he watched Sasuke move his piece at last and nodded at Sakura. True, Kakashi was a valuable piece, but he wasn't the queen he had in mind when he analyzed the team. Kiba and Hinata were akin to knights, able to move powerfully, but with restrictions. Kakashi was akin to a tower, able to move almost completely freely. Naruto, however, was where the deciding factor lay. It wasn't any one thing in the blonde, however. He wasn't academically brilliant, or an unmatched fighter. In a straight, no-holds-barred fight, Naruto would probably lose against anything more dangerous than AC-rank Shinobi. However, if Naruto forewent normal tactics, and just improvised, then the blonde had a tendency to tilt the odds in his favor with the most outrageous of plans. He thought back to the retake exam. The plan to hide in a hole, in the middle of a clearing, had been brilliant, but unfeasible if not for Naruto's presence. Neither he nor Hinata had the blonde's versatility or endurance to carve out a large enough hole in the ground as quickly as he had. On the other hand, when he and Hinata had found him, Shikamaru had been surprised at how effortlessly Naruto had found a rational and well-hidden spot to hide in. It had taken some thinking to get the boy to believe he'd messed up. And then there was his ability with shadow clones. Without Kage Bunshin, none of his plans for the second Genin exam would have worked. Asuma wasn't the type to go after his prey if he could lure them out, and it took him some effort and concentration to make the cage main work, much less work on the fly. Hinata, for her part, would have been petrified at having to face up against the Jounin. Only Naruto's Kage Bunshin had given them the ability to succeed. But no one would believe his assessment. Well, no one outside the Uzumaki clan, anyway. Naruto was still too young, too inexperienced to be credited with such feats. Most people still only remembered the loud troublemaker who sucked at school. Hell, it had taken him actually paying attention to the blonde to realize what a wild card he was. Shikamaru repressed a sigh. He knew it would take some time for people to recognize his friend's worth. And boy, would they be surprised. Wave Country Naruto gasped explosively as he landed roughly on the ground. Holy crap, was this guy kicking his ass. You should surrender, Shinobi-san, the gentle, feminine, and eerily familiar voice informed him calmly. As you can see, you are well outmatched. No kidding. Naruto could only wonder what had gone wrong as he slowly got back to his feet, his left arm bleeding a fair amount from the amount of senbon currently residing there. The fight had started off so well, too. He and Kakashi had arrived, in a too awesome to be faked big damn heroes moment, and had adequately scared Gato enough for the tiny man to run off, shouting at Zabuza and his lackey to deal with Kakashi and him while he went for reinforcements. So far, so good. Then Kakashi and Zabuza had started fighting, leaving Naruto, by process of elimination, to deal with the masked lackey. No problem, right? And then said lackey started kicking his ass. To be completely honest, Naruto was starting to appreciate the hellish training sessions under Takashi. It had somewhat helped to build up his resilience to pain and bodily damage. Otherwise, he would have long since passed out. Unfortunately, unlike said training sessions, there were no timeouts in the real world. Maybe, but I'm pretty stubborn. He groaned as he pushed himself off the ground and staggered back onto his feet. Kami, he hoped Kakashi was having a better time than he was. He craned his neck left, then right, sighing in relief as he felt it crack. Sides, there's no way I'm leaving old booze and wrinkles over there to Shorty McSuck, he added with a lopsided, much more confident than he felt grin. Oi, said Old Man protested, even as he still remained tied to the wooden cross. It's not that bad. I could light up a match and you'd explode, old man. Naruto called out over his shoulder, while his masked opponent stared at him silently. Or, at least, he assumed the guy was staring. He was pretty damn silent whenever he wasn't asking him to surrender. Your attempt at humor will not change your situation, Shinobi-san, his opponent informed him evenly. Naruto knew that, of course. Honestly, most sane shinobi just fought as professionally as they could, then got out. Bantering during fights was for amateurs. Or Uzumaki. While the original reason was to put the enemy off guard while the Uzumaki clansmen discreetly created seals, nowadays the Uzumaki just bantered during their fights for the sake of keeping the tension low. Also, nothing pissed off a committed opponent more than having their precious mission degraded with mockery. And angry opponents meant one of two things: an unfocused opponent, or, worst case scenario, massive collateral damage. Good odds, as far as the Uzumaki were concerned. Right now, however, Naruto had to find a way to get past his opponent's ridiculous defenses. The way he used ice reminded him starkly of his cousin Yuki, but his original clan had supposedly been wiped out. It did occur to Naruto to ask his opponent about his skills, but first he had to somehow get enough of an advantage where asking would not be dismissed out of hand as an empty ploy to distract. Bringing up his hands in a cross pattern and silently conjured up two shadow clones, almost sighing in exasperation as they promptly disappeared in a pop as two senbons ended each one. You seem to have run out of tricks, Shinobi-san. Shows what he knew. Naruto had plenty of tricks still in his bag, though admittedly, he couldn't find the right opportunity to use them. His foe was just too strong to take on head-on. Which, he figured, just meant he had to start thinking less one-dimensionally. If he couldn't go through the front, then without another word, Naruto turned tail and ran. For a moment, neither the enemy shinobi nor Tazuna did anything as they watched, surprised, as the blonde-haired, defiant ball of energy pretty much galloped away from the scene of battle. Wah, the masked shinobi said, quite shocked at this turn of events. The boy had never come across as a coward. Heck, he'd said as much just seconds ago. Was this a trick? Was he planning something with the bridge builder? You fucking coward. Apparently not. Get back here and fight, you little shit, said Old Man Ward indignantly. Hell no, the boy yelled as he tried to vault over a small grouping of cargo boxes a pair of merchants had left behind as the fight started. The masked shinobi watched the boy yelp as he clipped a box and fell out of view with a firm thud. A second later, he was back in view. Did you see that guy fight? Man, fuck that. I will strangle you in your sleep. I'd love to see you try, you booze hound. The masked shinobi just stared at the scene, unable to understand how such silliness was actually occurring. Where was the boy's calm, defiant dignity from seconds ago? This was more like something out of a man's-eye play. Nor did he know what to do. Should he attack the Konoha shinobi? After all, it seemed as though the boy had given up, so there was no real need to fight anymore, right? Right? Wrong. Without warning, the masked shinobi felt his feet get latched onto and his entire body pulled underground. The mercenary's eyes widened behind the mask. Had the boy executed a perfect Doton Shinju Zanshu no Jutsu without his knowledge? That wasn't a technique a genin should know. He paused then. He could feel his feet waggling in the air below ground. That wasn't part of the double suicide decapitation technique, the shinobi gasped suddenly as he felt a fist slam into his gut. His underground gut. All of a sudden, he realized the boy's argument with the old man had ended the moment he'd been dragged underground. Instead, that Naruto was just smirking at him. But if that was the case, then who was hitting him underground? It's not as fancy as the hole I made in the Genin exam, but it looks like it did the trick, said the blonde as he walked over to Tazuna and freed the old man from his bonds. Sorry it took so long, Gramps. Tazuna stared at him for a moment before clocking him on the head once in a chastising manner. Don't give me a heart attack like that, fool. Naruto yelped at the hit, then narrowed his eyes and jabbed the old man in the side, prompting an "poof" from the man. It was all according to plan. A very, very desperate plan, admittedly, but one that had worked nonetheless. Once he'd fallen out of view, he'd discreetly summoned a shadow clone and gotten them to dig their way underground towards the masked shinobi. The tunnel would be reinforced with chakra, like he'd been taught, to keep it solid and avoid a cave-in, and the enemy shinobi would then be dragged down and dealt with underground. Perfect, right? He liked to think so. That is, until he felt the air literally drop about a dozen degrees in temperature. Then, he winced as the clone's memories filtered in, and he realized that his plan hadn't exactly worked according to plan. Oh shit, Tazuna said flatly as he realized what was going on as well. Apparently, his little underhanded trick had somewhat ticked off his opponent, who was somehow able to make the seals necessary to mold chakra, and was now managing to turn the very ground into ice. Naruto eyed Tazuna, who eyed him back. You got a plan B, kid? The bridge builder asked. That was plan B. Naruto winced as the temperature dropped another few degrees. Plan C, then? You die in that one. Tazuna stared at him. Was the boy seriously making jokes even now? Knowing his opponent was about to unleash a torrent of pain on them both? Plan D it is, Naruto breathed as he saw small icicles form around the enemy shinobi, who was apparently drawing the necessary moisture right out of the air. Run. Elsewhere, unlike Naruto's fight, Kakashi's was most definitely not something out of a comedy act. Kunai and Blade clashed fiercely as Momochi Zabuza, the demon of the hidden mist, unleashed the full measure of his swordsmanship on the infamous Sharingan wielder. Splitting me up from Haku means nothing, Kakashi. Zabuza gloated. My subordinate is 20 times the measure of yours. Kakashi worried as much, truth be told. He'd left Naruto to fight the masked shinobi mostly out of trust that the boy wouldn't try to overdo things and seriously take on his opponent. If he knew anything about the boy, it was that Uzumaki Takashi, his personal trainer, had beat it into him not to throw his life away. That meant he had a very narrow window with which to deal with Zabuza, then the masked shinobi. Assuming Kimiko and Hikari didn't show up out of nowhere and help out. It struck him as amusing that this was the one time in recent memory when he was actually in a position to want their help. Naruto may be genin, but he's no slouch, he lied, knowing his subordinate didn't stand a chance in hell in a straight fight. Zabuza barked out a laugh. Unless he's got a bloodline, whatever edge your brat's got, is nothing against Haku's Hayatan. Well crap. Kakashi knew well of the Hayatan. Every seasoned shinobi knew of it. Back in the day, the ice techniques of the Yuki clan had been one of Water Country's most versatile and dangerous weapons. If one tried to take on a Hayatan user close to water, or in a humid environment, it was pretty much a guaranteed loss. And they were currently on an island. Great. Kakashi ducked under a swing and swept out his leg, hoping to catch the swordsman off guard. No dice. Zabuza easily hopped over and swung down at him. Kakashi quickly rolled off to the side and threw 4 shuriken. Blocked with a mere tilt of Zabuza's blade. Didn't matter, though. Kakashi jumped back and, taking advantage of Zabuza's need to cover himself, quickly ran through hand seals. He wasn't a big fan of overusing jutsus, but his opponent was not someone to take lightly. Katan Gokakyu no Jutsu. He thought, deftly pulling down his mask low enough to blow out the flames. Zabuza clicked his tongue in irritation as he saw the fireball headed towards him, and quickly dodged to the side, also flipping through hand seals. Without a word from the assassination specialist, A spiral torrent of water shot out of his outstretched palm, aimed right at Kakashi. The former ANBU turned on his heel to avoid the hit, drew 5 more shuriken from his pouch while he did so, and fired them off at Zabuza, who again deflected them with ease. This is Konoha's famed Sharingan no Kakashi. Zabuza taunted as he kept his blade in front of him, ready to deflect another barrage, if need be. Either Konoha's full of shit, or you're holding back, Kakashi. To be honest, it was both. Kakashi knew that his legend had probably been blown way out of proportion by both enemy Shinobi and Konoha. However, he was also holding back. Not because he wanted to toy with Zabuza, but because he had to play this smart. A no-holds-barred Shinobi match tended to get very destructive, and despite having moved away from the town center, he and Zabuza were still too near to a residential area to afford breaking out the big guns. He mused over the idea of summoning his Nin-ken, but shot that down for now. Unlike what Hikari told him of her wolves, his Nin-ken were mostly there for restraining and tracking. Not exactly attack material. TCH, Zabuza clicked his tongue irritably as he straightened up and slowly latched his sword onto his back. How boring. If you're not going to put your all into this, Kakashi, then I might as well end it. As much as I like playing around, I like getting paid more. Kirigakure no Jutsu. Kakashi frowned, recognizing the technique, but not budging around. Despite Zabuza's proficiency with silent killing, the Cyclopedian Shinobi had a burgeoning idea. He sidestepped an overhead swipe that would have bisected him into 2. A follow-up attempt to stab the missing Nin ended up hitting nothing but air. Holy crap, Zabuza really wasn't kidding about being good at being quiet. Kakashi narrowed his eyes. Yes, even the one behind his headband. If this crazy, insane idea that would have had him severely reprimanded by any sane superior officer was to work, he would have to time this perfectly. You know, Kakashi, Zabuza spoke silkily from somewhere within the mist. It's been what? 10? 15 minutes since we began our little private show here? What about it? Kakashi asked aloud, knowing the former mist ninja knew exactly where he was anyway. A dark chuckle answered him. I'm just wondering how that little genin of yours is doing right now. If I had to guess, not so hot. There was an ice pun in there, but Kakashi wasn't willing to acknowledge it. It was so awful. Even worse, the missing Nin had a point. He had to finish this, and he had to do so now. To his opponent's credit, Kakashi was only able to dodge the gigantic blade thanks to the very faint feeling of air being displaced as the blade came down. Had it been anyone but him, Zabuza would have killed them on the spot. Fortunately, he was almost as good as his legend made him out to be. And that was good enough to beat Zabuza. At the very last second, Kakashi rolled forward out of the blade's reach, but he apparently miscalculated, as it managed to nick his back just a bit. He grunted softly as the sharp pain raced through his body, but quickly got over it. Zabuza, for his part, seemed delighted at the realization that he'd hit the Cyclopedian Jounin. Getting slower, Kakashi? Pathetic. Kakashi narrowed his visible eye. Good. Zabuza was getting cocky. And he'd taken the bait. Pulling down his mask, he quickly bit into his thumb and quickly ran through the appropriate hand seals before slamming his hand onto the ground, prompting a reaction from Zabuza. What the fuck? The missing Nin cried out as he realized what Kakashi had done. Like I'd let you, Kakashi. Obviously, that meant he now had a huge blade swinging at his neck, but just before it could make contact, he saw the edge of it freeze in place, followed by a grunt of pain. Turning around, Kakashi saw the mist start to dissipate, and Zabuza being held in place by his trusty dogs. Each one had bitten down on one of Zabuza's limbs, forcing the swordsman to stay in place. You let yourself get slashed, Zabuza deduced immediately, narrowing his eyes in irritation. I should have known. Look at it this way, Kakashi mused as he grasped his wrist and charged up a Chidori. If it weren't for that little trick, I'd have been in big trouble. There's not many who could have done the same to me. Zabuza chuckled. It was his loss. No more words, then. Do it, Kakashi. Kakashi nodded and got ready to oblige the man. He was surprised, however. Unlike most missing nin, Zabuza wasn't begging for his life, or trying to barter. He had accepted his defeat, and was ready to face his maker. Very unlike his kind. Very dignified. Raikiri, he grunted, feeling the electricity course through his hand as it became a supercharged, ultra-sharp blade. Very little in this world would be able to withstand a blow from him now. To be ended by the lightning cutter, Zabuza mused as he saw the mass of electric blue chakra in Kakashi's hand. A good death. Kakashi was silent, breathing deeply as he felt his chakra reserves deplete significantly. Had he been in tip-top shape, he might have been able to pull it off rather easily, than 3 more times today. However, between his injury, the explosion at the bridge, and his worry for his student, he was a little worn out right now. Goodbye, Zabuza. He grunted as he readied to charge down the missing nin, arm raised and ready to tear a hole in the man's chest. And then stopped, frozen in place, as the worst imaginable chakra he'd ever felt in his life made a repeat appearance. The Kyuubi. Something had gone very, very wrong. Moments earlier Naruto breathed heavily, feeling pain in all his extremities thanks to the innumerable senbons his foe had stuck him with, as he leaned against an alley wall, still hiding from the masked enemy Shinobi. Next to him, Tazuna was wincing as he pulled out a senbon from his own shoulder. They'd only just managed to lose the enemy ninja by throwing some smoke bombs and ducking down a maze of beaten-down alleyways. Well, this makes it official. This mission sucks, Naruto joked as he grasped another senbon from his arm and tore it out, clenching his teeth to avoid crying out. Damn it, that hurts, he hissed. Geez, lad, Tazuna breathed in deeply before also pulling out another senbon. Did you have to piss him off like that? Can't help it, it's in my nature, Naruto defended himself as he peered out the corner down another alleyway. All clear. I don't much like the serious stuff, so I joke a lot. Keeps it low tension, less suffocating. He paused. Or, at least, that's what Hikarine said, he shrugged. Tazuna stared at him, like he was deciding whether or not to strangle him on principle. He perked up as he recognized a snapping noise. One of his traps had been activated. The enemy Shinobi was nearby. Come on, we've got to move, he urged his charge as he led them down another alleyway. Where the hell are you taking me? Tazuna demanded in a hiss as he followed the blonde ball of energy. I've lived here all my life and I don't recognize this place. Good, Naruto said firmly, nodding. If you're lost, then so's the masked dude. Tazuna blinked as he realized the blonde had a point. Perhaps he wasn't as dumb as he looked or acted. For his part, Naruto was glad, for once, that his early life had sucked so hard. Being unwanted in most social places, he had taken to explore the seedier areas of Konoha, and one thing he'd learned is that slums were a maze of hidden alleys and a cornucopia of hiding places. As long as you had a surefire way to find the exit, the slums were one of the best places around to hide. Where does this lead? He asked, pointing down an obscured alleyway. No idea. Good, let's go, he said, moving into said unknown ground. The shadows here were particularly long, given their position relative to the sun, meaning it made for some decent cover. It was far too bare for prolonged hiding, however. As soon as he thought it was safe to move, he'd have to move the old man elsewhere. Hopefully, this little cat and mouse routine would give Kakashi long enough to deal with Zabuza and come help him. Of course, when he told this story to Kiba and Hinata, he was going to make sure that it sounded like a properly epic fight, not him running away from one. Oh Shinobi-san, Naruto froze, staying perfectly still as he heard his foe's voice coming from nearby. Is possible, it sounded even more feminine now, but with that dangerous twang that let you know that if you got caught, you were going to pay dearly. And frankly, Naruto had no intentions of being any girl's punching bag. irony notwithstanding. He unnecessarily gestured for Tazuna to stay quiet, which prompted a glare from the old man, and waited with soft breaths, a nice trick his cousins had taught him, while the sound of footsteps got closer. Then closer. Closer still. Shit, had they been found out? Naruto got ready to grab Tazuna and make a break for it. But, just as he was about to crack, he heard the steps move away, a distinctly feminine grumble of frustration heralding the shinobi's departure. Naruto and Tazuna sighed in relief. Who knew his childhood survival skills would come in handy during his shinobi career? Let's go, Naruto spoke up. We'll backtrack our way back near the central plaza. Kakashi-sensei will be looking for us. Naruto had to give it to the masked shinobi, however there weren't many around who could track him this well. Jounin had a harder time keeping track of him than this guy did, and that was saying something. You really think your sensei's done with that masked freak? Tazuna asked softly as they carefully made their way back to the plaza. Tazuna grimaced as he apparently put his hand onto a wet surface. Naruto grinned confidently over his shoulder. Kakashi-sensei's the best. No way he'd lose against that dude, he declared before ducking under a collapsed fence. Tazuna smiled at Naruto's confidence, even if it was an empty boast, as neither really knew how Kakashi was faring. Still, a little confidence boost could go a long way. The old bridge builder followed his younger companion down the network of alleyways, a little surprised at how easily the blonde was managing to navigate, despite being a foreigner. For once, however, he felt some measure of hope. The boy seemed to have figured out that the best strategy was to lay low and wait out Kakashi and Zabuza's fight, and hope for some reinforcements. A straight fight would get them nowhere. Come on, nearly there, Naruto spoke softly as they turned a final corner, leading them back to the plaza. They wouldn't actually go out into the open, but rather stay hidden nearby, to keep an eye out for Kakashi's return. Up ahead, Naruto could see the alley's exit. About halfway there, however, he found a small, obviously unused path that ran along Plaza's adjacent buildings, and led Tazuna there. We should be good here, he whispered to his charge. Tazuna seemed a little more confident now than before, but there was still a trace of worry on his face. Naruto could sympathize. The masked shinobi was obviously no slouch at tracking. How long would their detour really fool him? I'll send out shadow clones to get the guy off our trail, Naruto offered, prompting a relieved nod from Tazuna. Silently, he made 4 copies appear. Nodding significantly at them, he watched his body double silently make their way back into the labyrinth of backstreet alleys. There, he said with a smile, turning back to Tazuna. That should do it. At that moment, Naruto felt something wet hit his face, and he shut his eyes, grimacing as he felt it splatter near his eyes. He heard Tazuna give a pained grunt. Ugh, what was that? He cried out indignantly. Blinking as he opened his eyes, Naruto rubbed off the wetness from near his eyes and froze as his sleeve came into view. Blood. Looking up, he saw Tazuna stumble as an arrowhead peeked out of his shoulder. Before Naruto could do anything, the bridge builder fell forward, landing roughly onto the ground. 3 more arrows peppered the man's back. Still in shock, Naruto's eyes went from the bridge builder's still body up the alleyway, towards the back alley crossroad, and beyond. There, standing with smug smiles of accomplishment, were 4 of Gado's mercenaries, already reaching for ammunition. Looks like we get to share Gado's bounty, boys, the lead thug gloated as all 4 raised their bows again, metallic arrowheads glinting in the small amount of sunlight that penetrated the alley's shadows. Naruto heard none of it. His gaze was once again fixed on Tazuna, who was lying silently on the ground, a small pool of blood already forming beneath him. He'd failed. Tazuna was dead. His client was dead. The only man in this entire rotting village willing to stand up to Gado, and he'd let him die. His mind shut down and restarted. And shut down again. Blood thumped in his ears. His fist unconsciously tightened until his knuckles were white. His teeth slowly grit together, until, were it not for the adrenaline pumping through him, his jaw hurt. Time to die, punk, the lead thug gloated again as all four loosened their grip on the bowstring. The thumping in his ears increased. He felt white-hot rage bubbling with him, and a feral roar pierced through his mind, begging to be released. Naruto yelled. And everything went red. Tsuna's house Hikari shivered the moment the foul chakra swept over the area, feeling its effects as though it were a gust of chilled air. Her thoughts, naturally, turned immediately to Naruto. She may not have ever encountered a bijou before, but there was sufficient documentation amongst the Uzumaki scrolls to piece together what was happening. Naruto, she whispered in concern. She glanced back at the still forms of Kiba and Hinata. Both were beginning to stir, no doubt equally affected by the demonic chakra. For a second, Hikari contemplated leaving them with Tsunami and going to help Naruto, but the blonde would never forgive her if something happened to his friends in her absence. Bad enough she'd already lost track of Inari, causing Tsunami to be beside herself with worry. She grit her teeth and prayed Kimiko would arrive in time. She was jolted, then, as she felt her tattoo act up. As she felt the design pulse at irregular intervals, she quickly realized someone was coding in Morse. Her eyes widened, and she felt like slapping herself. Of course. She waited for the messages to stop, realizing they were from Kakashi to Kimiko, and then got ready for her own blast. It was time to turn Gato's tricks against him. With Inari was not a shinobi, so to him all chakra was the same. That was how it had been for most of his life, and had he never met the Konoha shinobi, that would have been his mentality for the rest of his life. But he had, and now he'd been exposed to something foul enough to make him retch in an alley near his next target. Wiping some drool from the corner of his mouth, the young boy shivered as the feeling of dread lingered. A day ago, it would have been enough to make him run back home, crying for mommy. Now, however, he had something to prove, and a grandfather to save, and he wasn't about to let this stop him either. Without further delay, he went to the door and knocked. With Kakashi, I know that chakra, Zabuza spoke wide-eyed as he remained held down by Kakashi's dogs. That is Bijou chakra, he realized, snapping his gaze to his would-be executioner. You brought a Jinchuriki? Kakashi understood Zabuza's consternation. Jinchuriki were walking natural disasters, whether or not they controlled their tenants. Bringing one along for any mission was a risky gambit, especially if they were emotionally untrained. Wait, you're telling me that blonde punk was a Jinchuriki? The missing nin realized then. The revelation prompted him to struggle desperately against the dogs restraining him. Oh, hell no. Haku. Kakashi spun around, Chidori still activated, almost expecting Zabuza's masked partner to show up and skewer him. To his surprise, however, they were still very much alone, meaning Zabuza had been showing concern. Very surprising. He hadn't expected the infamous monster of the hidden mist to have a soft side. Just goes to show. Quickly, he ran through the numerous scenarios he could think of that would explain Naruto losing control. None of them were very promising, and more than a few resulted in the annihilation of this tiny island kingdom. Time to do some damage control, then, and reorder his priorities. Chidori still buzzing in his hand, he raised it so Zabuza could see what was coming. Immediately, the missing nin stopped his struggling and glared at him. To the man's surprise, however, Kakashi was not looking to kill him anymore. Listen up, Zabuza, Kakashi said. You're right. My student is a Jinchuriki. Normally, that means I kill you to keep that fact secret. Unfortunately, I'm in no shape to take him on if he's lost control, and you just revealed that you care what happens to your partner. And the fact that thanks to that blast of demon chakra, the cat was out of the bag, so here's what I propose: truce. Help me keep my student under control, and we can finish our fight afterwards. A risky gambit, considering that Zabuza was under no obligation to stick around after he found his apprentice. Frankly, Kakashi was grasping for straws here, considering he had no idea where Kimiko was, and she wasn't responding to his Morse code signals over the Uzumaki tattoo. At full strength, he might have chanced going solo against Naruto, but between fighting Zabuza and his injury from the bridge explosion, he wasn't exactly in optimal conditions. Zabuza naturally glared at him, and Kakashi was willing to bet the man would just bolt the minute he met up with this Haku fellow. If you think, the man growled behind the face wraps. Whatever else he said, however, Kakashi drowned out as he felt his tattoo act up. At first, he sighed in relief as he expected the return message to come from Kimiko, but then frowned as he interpreted the code. It wasn't Kimiko. It was Hikari. Why was Hikari butting in? Had Kiba and Hinata woken you? He froze. As Hikari's message went on, he reeled from the implications of the girl's message. Of course. No wonder Gado's army of mercenaries never seemed to have more than a couple of missing nins at a time. No wonder his fiercest enemies always seemed to die so easily. Gado's going to betray you, he told Zabuza simply, cutting off the man's tirade. Zabuza predictably stopped, then glared even more fiercely. You're reaching, Kakashi. The man paid me. We're square. And I'll bet it wasn't like you expected? Kakashi asked, very much aware of the nearby explosions and screaming. Whatever had set off Naruto was probably about to become an ugly stain on the ground, along with the surrounding blocks. He needed to move fast. Something off about that whole transaction. He saw Zabuza narrow his eyes not in anger, but in reluctant, pensive agreement, and he knew he'd hit it on the nail. Paper money. From Mizu. Kakashi made a mental note to kiss Hikari when next he saw her. I'll bet you anything Gado tipped off Kiryu be coming, he told his would-be victim. You might have escaped from lone hunters before, but what about a dedicated task force? Think your chances are good then? You underestimate our abilities to hide in plain sight, Kakashi, Zabuza growled. Haku and I have hidden from worse. No way Gado screwed me over. He knows his head's on the line. Then why didn't he tell you he sent mercenaries to kidnap Tazuna's family? Kakashi asked pointedly. As expected, that shut Zabuza up. He did what? The man asked softly, but no less angrily. Already, Kakashi saw the gears working in the missing nin's head. Let me guess the rest. You didn't tell him you were going to split us up. You didn't tell him about blowing up the bridge. He just assumed you'd fight us there. If that's true, why did he need Tazuna's family if he trusted you to get the job done? Kakashi asked. You know what I think? He expected both of us to wear the other down, and then clean up. If that didn't work, he had the cash ready to send you to a death trap, or the family to coerce Tazuna to leave our protection. He's done it before, Zabuza. You were just another sacrificial pawn to him. Zabuza growled, but this time Kakashi knew it wasn't directed at him, but rather at Gado. That little, fat fuck, he snapped. I'm going to gut him the next chance I get. Kakashi nodded, somewhat sympathizing. Not too much, though after all, Zabuza had tried to kill him and his students. And kidnapped his client. And handed the man over to a brutal dictator. Yeah, his sympathy didn't run very deep right now. That said, he needed the man's help with his wayward student. Compromises and all that. So, we got a deal, he asked carefully, very deliberately lowering the intensity of his Chidori as he reabsorbed the chakra into his system. Zabuza glared at him, but then nodded. Deal, Kakashi. As long as I get to make that fat ass a head shorter, and Haku and I get to leave unimpeded afterwards. Kakashi nodded and turned off his Chidori completely. Good thing, too. If he'd used the Chidori on Zabuza, then tried to take on Naruto, his chances of bringing Naruto back under control without significant maiming or needing to kill his student weren't good. Having non-monstrous chakra reserves sucked like that. Another explosion nearby brought him back to reality. He snapped his fingers, and his Ninken disappeared without another word. Zabuza glowered at him as he rubbed his injured limbs, but then picked up his sword and nodded at him. Kakashi took a breath, steadying his nerves, and then nodded back. Let's go. Main Plaza. Pain, fury, despair. A myriad of emotions swam through Naruto's being as he stood in the middle of nothingness. Everywhere he looked, all he saw was darkness. He looked down, and he saw himself well enough, almost like he was standing in the light, but everywhere else was just black. Slowly, he remembered what had happened. His charge, Tazuna, had been following him through the labyrinth of slum alleys as they played a lethal version of hide and seek with Zabuza's masked partner. For a while, everything had gone right. His skills at hiding had come in handy, and soon enough, they'd been in the clear, while his shadow clones took care of misdirecting their pursuer. And that had been where everything had gone wrong. So confident was he that he'd succeeded that he'd failed to notice or remember that Gato had escaped, promising reinforcements. And those reinforcements had arrived. They'd shot Tazuna 3 times. The bridge builder was dead. Like a beating heart, he felt everything around him pulse red for an instant before the black returned. A soft, deep chuckle full of malice seemed to tease his hearing before it was gone. Tazuna didn't deserve his fate. Naruto had liked the older man, despite his cantankerous personality. Whenever the weight of his duty wasn't causing him to be moody, the man had been jovial, rowdy, almost like his family. He didn't mince words, nor did he dismiss him out of hand, like so many adults did. After seeing him and his friends in action during the first ambush, Tazuna had reevaluated his worth and treated him better. Tazuna didn't deserve his fate. Again, the black gave way to a pulse of red. Again, the malicious chuckle returned briefly, gaining strength. He was sure now that he hadn't been hearing things. He grimaced, holding his stomach. It hurt. It felt like something wanted out, trying to tear its way out of his body. With every bout of rage, he felt it gain strength. Was it the Kyuubi? Mizuki had called him a Jinchuriki, but his family and teacher had been very tight-lipped as to what that entailed, exactly. He'd come to figure that the monster fox would just stay dormant within him. But this wasn't dormant. The pulse of red came again, and lasted longer. His fury rose, as well. Flashes of Tazuna's fate bombarded his consciousness, and he felt his blood boil further and further every time he glimpsed the bridge builder's body. The chuckling was beginning to really take off, now. If it continued like this, it would soon become full-out laughter. He whimpered, half expecting the flashes to come back, forcing him into a deeper pit of anger, grief, and despair. What came instead was much worse. Before his eyes, he saw the moment the arrows pierced Tazuna's back, splattering him with the bridge builder's blood. The black shattered like glass. All around him, Naruto saw a sewer take shape, leading up to a cage. At the center, way up above him, what appeared to be 2 doors were held shut by a flimsy piece of paper. He felt the urge to remove that paper, but quashed it down. And then the voice came. So, my jailer comes at last. Naruto shivered unwillingly. The voice reeked of malice. It was as though every fiber of his being was being polluted by rage and violence. Behind the cage doors, in the darkness beyond, Naruto swore he could see something shift. Something furry. The cage's bars shook, and for a minute, Naruto feared the paper would come loose and let whatever was inside out. A pity. It seems like you are not yet ready to let me out. Naruto didn't need to ask, but did so anyway. Who are you? He asked defiantly. The voice chuckled, amused. You know already. Behind that false bravado, you know exactly who I am, little human. Again, something shifted behind the cage, and to his horror, 2 yellow orbs slowly emerged from the darkness, followed by the sound of masses of fur bristling. Then, slowly, Naruto saw what seemed to be a massive tail slide by, and then muscular haunches flexing as the creature beyond rose to its full, terrifying height. Without him wanting to, torches lit up along the sewer, and into the cage, illuminating his nightmare and somehow managing to make it so much worse. As a huge canine snout turned down to stare at him disdainfully, there was no denying it anymore. I am the Kyubi no Kitsune, Lord of all Bijou, Scourge of humanity. The monster fox's lips curled into a snarl. Welcome, my jailer. I have unknown Naruto could easily list out the number of times he'd actually feared for his life. Surprisingly, it wasn't that long. However, more to the point, he was pretty damn scared right now. He supposed it had something to do with the fact that a gigantic, evil, human fox hybrid was apparently staring down at him as though it was consciously making the choice not to eat him. Equally gigantic metal bars in the way notwithstanding. Nor was he capable of formulating words at all. For once in his life, he'd been stricken dumb, unable to speak as he still processed the fact that this enormous evil plushie of doom was somehow stuck in his gut. How was that even feasible? The Bijou chuckled at the sight of him, and somehow that stuck in Naruto's craw. He supposed he had a fairly low tolerance for people mocking him, and he knew the giant furball was looking down on him literally and figuratively speaking. What's so funny? Asked Breath. Naruto challenged. A bit of an unfair remark, considering the Bijou's breath actually smelled nothing like that, but it did the trick of stopping the Bijou cold. Instead, it now slammed several its tails against its prison bars. The whole world seemed to shake as the monster fox rammed against the rails. As expected, Naruto lost his footing and fell on his ass, a little shaken by the sudden act of violence. The Bijou snorted. Pathetic. You call yourself Shinobi? Naruto glowered up at the monster fox despite his fear. He knew there were many things he didn't understand, but he knew this much: he was being underestimated and mocked. That was good enough for him to get fired up. Big talk from the world's largest prisoner, Fuzzbutt, he snarked. The Bijou growled throatily, but said nothing. Where am I? Did you do this? He demanded as he got to his feet and stepped closer to the cage. A casual observation told him the bars didn't seem even remotely affected by the tail swipe. Again, the Bijou chuckled. Me? Summon my jailer? Amusing. The beast shifted, its fur rippling as it moved into a more comfortable position. For all appearances, it had decided to ignore Naruto, opting instead for a nap. Though it irritated Naruto to no end, he decided caution was the better part of valor, and maintained his distance from the jail bars. If not you, then who? He insisted. The beast snorted. There are only two of us present. Whom do you think? Naruto frowned. He knew what the beast was getting at, but it made no sense. Why would he willingly bring himself to meet his prisoner? Ever since finding out about his burden, he had just assumed that it was out of reach, beyond contact. Though, to be honest, even if he'd thought he could contact the Kyubi, why on earth would he? As far as he was concerned, he knew enough. This beast had plagued his mother, and his ancestor, Lady Mito. It had brought him nothing but misery during his childhood. It continued being a focal point of anger amongst the villagers he still desperately wanted to accept him. Why would he come here indeed? You reach, yet you do not understand. Typical human maggot. Naruto snapped out of his thoughts to see the Kyubi had opened one of its eyes, its terrible gaze on him. It was unnerving, seeing the giant, yellow, slitted eye peering down on him. What the hell is that supposed to mean? He demanded. The Kyubi snorted, clearly unintimidated. Information isn't free, my jailer. Why should I help you, when already you take my strength, my power, to wreak havoc on your foes? Naruto frowned. That didn't sound right. When had he used the Kyubi's power? He could practically feel the foul chakra radiating from the Bijou, and he could safely say he'd never used anything like that. You're lying, he accused. After all, he was here, so how could he be wreaking havoc, or whatever? You truly do not understand, do you? The Kyubi shifted again, slowly getting back to its feet. Its lips curled into a nasty, toothy grin. Release your senses, my jailer, and you will understand. Naruto eyed the Kyuubi warily. There was little sense in listening to it, much less taking advice from it. Especially when it looked giddy at the thought of him doing so. Even so, it had raised a troubling question had he used Bija Chakra. It would explain how he got to this weird dimension, where he could finally see his prisoner and the seal that kept him at bay. In the face of that, he had to wonder whether or not it was worth the risk. He supposed that as long as he kept away from the piece of paper, everything should be fine. Edging further away from the cage, prompting a dark, amused laugh from the beast, Naruto glowered at his prisoner before closing his eyes and taking a deep breath. Honestly, he had no idea how he could possibly release his sense pain. All at once, Naruto was overwhelmed by a tidal wave of heartache, despair, and fury. It felt like every fiber of his being had been coated in anger and grief. He felt his muscles contract and stretch, clearly doing something, though what that was, he had no idea. He tried to control himself, to push back against the tide, but found it an exercise in futility. In the distance, faintly, he could hear screaming and the sound of combat, but even as he tried his best to see, he could not. Soon enough, he hoped he could just go back to the sewer, and to his surprise, his surroundings shattered like glass again. The Kyuubi was there. The sewer-like environment. Right back where he started. With one exception. Whereas he had left the place several meters away from the cage, he found himself now reaching up for the seal, under the watchful, eager gaze of his prisoner. It returns. The Kyuubi sounded disappointed, and slowly curled back into a more comfortable position. A pity. A little more, and I might have wreaked my vengeance on your pathetic kind to my heart's content. Naruto belatedly realized he was breathing quite rapidly, and his heart felt like it was trying to tear its way out of his chest. What the hell was that? He demanded. What did you do to me? The beast snorted from behind the bars. I did nothing. You merely saw what your feeble mind tried to block. The unrepentant, unrestrained fury you are capable of. Liar. Naruto shouted, though deep down he knew the Bijou wasn't lying. What he had felt, as much as it had felt like drowning in emotional agony, it had been his agony. He couldn't explain how he knew that, other than its intrinsic familiarity. The Kyuubi snorted. So you say, yet you already recognize the truth. Naruto clenched his fists until his hands hurt. Then he clenched some more. He was worried, more worried than he'd ever felt, actually. If his friends had been around, he might have just cut the tension with a joke, or played the fool, but he was alone now, and he recognized the dire straits he was in. His body wasn't under his control anymore. Was it under the fox's? Give me back control of my body, he ordered the beast, despite his fear of it. The Kyuubi actually laughed at that. Amusing. You still think I am the one in control? What a poor jailer I am chained to. Naruto grimaced, feeling like he'd been sucker punched. That had cleared up one worry and then magnified it 100-fold. If it wasn't the fox controlling his body, that meant whatever it was doing, it was his own fault. Why is this happening to me? He asked softly. He hadn't expected an answer, truthfully, so when the Bijou decided to speak, it surprised him. Humans. It snorted contemptuously as one eye opened and gazed down on him. So proud and boisterous, yet so feeble of mind. You think yourselves masters of all, yet you are but usurpers of the natural order. And when the power you steal becomes too much, you whine, you cry, you collapse. Feeble-minded and fragile of spirit. A pathetic race. Okay, the fox might have a point, but at this point, Naruto really didn't care. He wasn't about to let some giant fox monster stuck in his stomach look down on him anymore, damn it. If he was so powerful, why was the so-called Lord of the Bijous stuck in some kid's stomach, huh? So what does that say about you, jackass? He challenged, recklessly drawing nearer to the bars. My ancestor held you. My mom held you, and now you're my prisoner. If we suck so hard, what about you? That actually drew out an angry snarl from the fox monster. Such brave words. I wonder how brave you would be if not for this cage, jailer. Naruto knew the fox was still trying to entice him into releasing the seal, but he'd seen this play too often to fall for it. Not again. Who knows? He asked with a knowing smirk. But for now, you're just going to rot in there, while I take care of this problem. The growl from behind the bars grew in magnitude, but Naruto was already moving away, knowing he'd scored at least a small, moral victory against his tenant. Another problem presented itself now, however. He had tried to return to a full state of consciousness before, but the experience had nearly overwhelmed him. If the beast was right, that meant he was pretty much beyond reach. It didn't take him too much effort to realize why that was. Naruto prided himself on keeping things internalized. When he whined, cried, or complained, people who enjoyed tormenting him just made things worse. Therefore, the best offense, in that sense, was no offense. If he looked like he was enjoying himself just as much as they were, then the taunting and discrimination would well not stop, but definitely lessen, as people lost interest. But even if that had just been a defense mechanism, though he didn't recognize it as such, he had failed to account for the fact that it had permeated into his dealings with even those he considered friends. He laughed, and smiled, and joked with Kiba and the others, but the truth was that behind that perfectly happy facade was a young boy suffering under enormous psychological pressure. His family was back. That had been cause for celebration, but at the same time, it had provoked the rise of another slew of problems. He could play the idiot until the cows came home, but he knew his family was having trouble integrating into Konoha. He also knew it wasn't entirely the locals' fault. Then there was the whole business about him becoming clan head. At 13. How ridiculous was that? Yet, he was so desperate for his family to love him, to accept him, that he'd thoughtlessly charged into the situation without looking back. Now, he had 2 clan cells out there in the world waiting to see if he could prove himself a worthy leader, while trying to bring back Kamiko into the fold, and dealing with Raiden's taunts that he would fail. And that didn't even touch upon the fact that the Hokage trusted him to remain impartial between his clan duties and his duties as a shinobi. Trusted him. He hadn't felt that in so long. He was desperate not to let the old man down. But at the same time, his family expected him to honor his clan by becoming their best show of talent. It was all just too much, and then Tazuna, his charge, had gone and died. On his watch. To some no-name thugs with adequate aim in the use of a bow and arrow. And that's when he broke. Naruto sighed, pushing aside the depressing thoughts as he looked around him and saw the sewer go on forever. There would be no walking out of this one. He would have to regain control of his body the old-fashioned way by sheer guts. Except the last time he'd attempted to do so, he'd almost let out the Kyuubi. He couldn't let that happen. Unfortunately, he also didn't have ropes or anything of the sort to chain him down. And that's when the first bit of pain hit him. Naruto flinched, somewhat surprised, as he felt his left arm flare up in pain briefly. Just as fast, the sensation was gone. But then it was his leg. Then his left side. Within seconds, he was on his knees, grasping at phantom wounds. What the hell was going on? Wave Country, Tazuna's village. Moments earlier Kakashi could scarcely believe his hyperactive student was responsible for all this. After establishing his shaky truce with Zabuza, the 2 skilled shinobi had returned to the main plaza, where they both half expected to see Zabuza's protege in dire straits against an enraged Jinchuriki. The reality was much worse. Much of the buildings near the plaza had been leveled. On their way there, they had passed dozens of thugs and local residents running for their lives. Zabuza made quick work of the thugs, no doubt relieving some of his fury towards Gato by murdering his goons. Kakashi hadn't approved, but then he needed the man around for helping him neutralize his student, and as long as Zabuza didn't harm any civilians, he didn't really care enough to intervene. But it wasn't until they reached the plaza that they understood the gravity of the situation. Standing amidst the rubble, or rather bent onto all fours, with three very ominous tails swishing back and forth, was Naruto. Or what he expected to be Naruto. Truth was, he could barely tell anymore. There was a dark red cloak about him, which obscured his student almost entirely. Yet, he could still see hints of the boy's clothes, giving him a positive ID. "Geez, Kakashi," he heard Zabuza speak up incredulously. "If I'd known about this, you'd still have tried," Kakashi cut him off. Zabuza shrugged. It was true. We need to get him back under control. Fortunately, he's not all gone yet. How can you tell? The missing Nin asked seriously. There's only 3 tails, Kakashi answered honestly. There was a moment of uncomfortable silence. Do I even want to know? 9. Kakashi heard Zabuza swear softly, and felt like joining him. To be honest, he'd rather wanted to avoid telling him that, but Zabuza would always be on tiptoes if he believed Naruto be on the verge of going full bijou on them. This way, the missing Nin wouldn't cut his losses quite so quickly. Still, it presented a dilemma about what to do with the man afterwards. He'd promised him to let him go, but letting a missing Nin, of all people, run around knowing who the Kyuubi's Jinchuriki was, well, that was just plain idiotic. Well, he'd have to cross that bridge when he got to it. Right now, he had a rampaging Jinchuriki to deal with. Bringing that boy down is going to be a hell of a workout, Hatake, Zabuza noted. No killing, Zabuza, Kakashi warned him. He may be out of control right now, but he's my student. Zabuza scoffed. Dream on, Hatake. If it comes down to me or him, let's just say I'm not feeling too altruistic right now. Kakashi glared at the missing Nin, but had to concede the point. Zabuza had zero incentive to even help him out, much less risk life and limb to safely capture Naruto. Meaning, if Naruto was to come out of this situation in one piece, Kakashi had to make sure to be the one doing the capturing. Master. Kakashi frowned as he watched Zabuza's partner show up, landing next to the missing Nin. His mask was still on, but he did seem a little worse for wear. Clearly, he'd taken the safe approach and stayed as far away as possible from his student. Haku, Zabuza greeted his partner. What the hell happened here? The masked shinobi was silent for a moment before nodding at Zabuza. Kakashi guessed he'd been wondering whether or not to treat Kakashi as hostile. Apparently not. I was chasing the bridge builder and the blonde boy when it happened, Haku said. I lost sight of them for a moment, and the next thing I know, there's a large explosion and Gado's thugs are running for their lives. Kakashi knew there was more to the story, but guessed Haku wasn't privy to it. The fact of the matter was, Jinchuriki didn't just explode at random. They had mental triggers, typically tied to powerful emotions like anger or fear. Whatever had set off Naruto, it must have rattled the boy something fierce. Where's the bridge builder, Tazuna? He asked then, hoping the old man had gotten out okay. Haku was silent again for a moment before nodding. I'm unaware of his whereabouts, the masked shinobi stated neutrally. As I said, I lost sight of them while chasing them. Meaning any number of things. Tazuna could be well. Tazuna could be dead. Tazuna could simply be missing. Kakashi wasn't a betting man, but he was willing to wager some money that Tazuna had something to do with his student losing his cool. Zabuza, our deal is still on, right? He asked, knowing that the real reason the missing Nin had agreed to help was to retrieve the man's partner. To his surprise, Zabuza nodded. Gado's still alive. As long as he's not a head shorter, we still got a deal, Hatake. What's the play? He asked. From a look at Haku's body language, Kakashi could see the sudden shift in allegiance surprised the missing Nin. Keep my student busy. I'll work on a trap to hold him down, he stated. It was a sensible plan after all. He doubted Zabuza's idea of a trap was anything more intricate than a jutsu or two, which would be ineffective against a rampaging Jinchuriki. The missing Nin nodded and turned to look at his partner. Haku, you're with me, he stated gruffly. Yes, Zabuza-sama. In the blink of an eye, both missing Nin were gone, charging his student head-on. For his part, Kakashi sought the nearest high ground and crouched there to observe the situation from a broader perspective. He watched as Zabuza and Haku blindsided Naruto, though ineffectively. His enraged student merely turned to his new opponents and let off a bestial roar that sent chills down his spine. It reminded him all too much of that night, years ago, when his master had died. The problem was that a Jinchuriki had massive chakra reserves to tap into, meaning that just confining Naruto wouldn't cut it. He needed to be knocked out, or drained enough to cut off his link to the Kyuubi's chakra. The problem was, how to do so without taking most of the village with them. Kakashi growled irritably. He wished he'd used the Sharingan on one of the Uzumaki's restraining seals, but he knew that such acts were considered grievous offenses amongst the newly returned clan. He glanced down at his arm, where his temporary Uzumaki tattoo lay. Could he call up Hikari to come and help? Doing so would leave Tsunami, her son, and his other two unconscious students unprotected and with Gato running loose, with an army of mercenaries probably on their way. He wasn't that anxious to leave anyone undefended. Which just left Kimiko, but she had gone AWOL ever since his student had chewed her out. At the time, he'd felt proud of Naruto for standing up for his beliefs, but he was starting to wish the blonde had gone easier on the girl, as they were now left without a Fuin user. Kakashi grit his teeth as he watched Haku narrowly save Zabuza from being eviscerated by a pissed-off Jinchuriki. Things weren't going well, and his only options were using conventional jutsus. Maybe form a trap hole, or bury Naruto while they went for the money shot to knock him out. Kakashi already knew they'd fail. Right now, the best shot they had was to wear his student down, while avoiding getting killed. Damn it, he cursed softly. So many things could go wrong with such a plan. A hand could slip, or a jutsu misfire, and suddenly he didn't have an injured student, but rather a dead one. Or one's footing or blocking maneuver could go wrong, and suddenly he was down one man. He was really starting to wish that he'd asked Jiraiya for some Fuin lessons now. Zabuza-sama. Kakashi's attention snapped to the fight once more, belatedly realizing that Zabuza had missed a wide swing, and was now completely open to Naruto's retaliatory swipe. From that distance, whatever Naruto did to the missing Nin, the man would not be getting back up. While Haku quickly flipped through hand seals, already apparently forming what appeared to be a slab of ice floating about 5 inches above ground, Kakashi swore and jumped from his perch into the battle, managing to catch Naruto's attention in time and knocking his student aside with a well-placed kick to the face. He made a mental note to apologize later. "Thanks, Hatake," Zabuza said as he came over to his side. The man's partner swiftly joined them, challenging Naruto with a united front. Kakashi nodded in acquiescence of the man's thanks. "Any ideas, Hatake-san?" Zabuza's partner asked. Kakashi grimaced beneath his mask. "None worthwhile. Looks like we'll have to slug it out till either he's tired, or we're dead," he said honestly. Zabuza glared at him, then returned his attention to the enraged Kyuubi container. "Fan-freaking-tastic," he muttered. "Don't suppose he'll let me and Haku go if we just bolt, huh?" Kakashi chuckled. "Probably not." He heard Zabuza sigh exasperatedly. "Figures. Haku, you still good to go?" "Yes, Zabuza-sama." Kakashi eyed the duo and felt a bit of respect for them. They were clearly well matched, and fully in sync. He'd seen them trade blows with Naruto from his perch, and they'd complemented each other beautifully. Ahead of them, Naruto's shadowed form growled angrily. "Hatake, I'll take the front. Haku'll pepper your boy with long-range attacks." "What's your contribution?" Zabuza asked. Kakashi chuckled again. "I'll keep his attention divided," he said. Naruto's growl became a bestial howl as the shrouded boy charged them. Immediately, Haku jumped away, while Kakashi waited a second longer to do the same. Only Zabuza stood his ground, great sword in front of him, and faced the oncoming Jinchuriki with a challenging cry of his own. Spinning on one foot, Zabuza dodged the swipe of the boy's clawed hands and smacked him aside with a swing of his greatsword, using the flat of the blade to avoid killing him. As Naruto flew, Haku appeared next to him midair and drop-kicked him, right into Kakashi's position. "Sorry, Naruto," he muttered as he watched the boy fly towards him. Without another second's hesitation, Kakashi clasped his hands together, raised them above his head, and smashed down onto Naruto's head as he came into range, smashing the boy into the ground, kicking up a fair bit of dust. Clearing his vision with a wave of his hand, Kakashi looked down at the still body of his student, still shrouded in that demonic red chakra. Had it worked? Would he finally calm down? He started to crouch to reach for his student. "Kakashi, move." Before he knew what had happened, Kakashi felt a stinging sensation on his cheek, right before he was knocked aside. Looking up at the sky, he only had moments to wonder what had happened when he heard Naruto howl in pain. For a minute, he thought Zabuza had gone back on their deal and killed his student. Looking over, he could only blurrily make out what seemed to be numerous large, thin objects pinning his student down into the ground by his limbs. Shaking off disorientation, Kakashi flipped onto his haunches and was about to charge at his student's attacker, only to realize that it hadn't been Zabuza who'd hurt his student. It was Kimiko. Kimiko had never felt so conflicted in her life. Well, that wasn't true. The day her parents died, she'd certainly been a basket case. Even so, this was either a close second or a tie for first. For years, hell, more than a decade, she'd carried the burning fury and despair of her loss deep within her, feeding off of it in order to grow stronger than anyone. Strong enough to prevent another, similar tragedy. But it had come at a cost. She understood that, but she'd never regretted it. By walking down her chosen path, she became isolated even within her family. No one wanted to be near her because they feared her. Even those closest to her, Hikari, Natsu, Keisuke, Akemi, held their distance and treated her differently than the other clan members. Every smile was just the tiniest bit forced. Every thanks held caution. Every time she got bad news, they'd walk on eggshells around her. She didn't mind. No, that wasn't accurate. She did mind, but she forced herself not to mind. None of them understood the depths of her pain, and that she was doing what she thought was necessary to protect the clan. The only family she had left in this world. But at what cost? The very family she swore to herself to defend with life and limb crept ever farther away. They respected her, treated her well, but she could see it now, in hindsight, that she was almost a foreigner within her own family. What did she know of her fellow clansmen? How many nieces, nephews, cousins, aunts, and uncles had she gained and lost over the years? She knew how many clansmen there were in total, but she realized she knew none of them. It was jarring, and it was all the new, future, clan head's fault. The moment he confronted her, the moment he threw back her pain in her face, it was as though she had been forced to turn around and see the wreckage of her life for the first time, in all its dreadful glory. She had envisioned herself the stalwart shield of the Uzumaki, but she now realized that she had no one behind her to protect. And then there was Hatake, her future clan head's teacher. Even as Naruto's words cut deep into her soul, he slid the knife in even further, reminding her that a clan head without integrity is not a clan head worth having. Personally, she prided herself on her moral righteousness. It was one of the backbones of her sense of duty to the clan. Yet there she was, advocating in favor of leaving behind a suffering nation just to save a future clan head who wanted to stay and fight for what's right. When had she become the villain? Kimiko hated to admit she was wrong, but she had to concede this time. She was wrong. Wrong, 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 wrong. Maybe, practically, it would have been best for them to leave Nami cold. Leave Tazuna and his family to Gado's mercy after all. They were just nobody civilians who'd lied about their offered contract. But morally, it would have been repugnant. There was no honor in leaving the weak at the mercy of the strong and cruel. She couldn't remember how long she'd stood where Naruto and Hatake had left her, but it seemed like ages as she reflected on her life, her choices. She distantly realized Hikari and Hatake exchanging messages over the tattoo, but made no move to answer them. She was in no shape to do anything. Until she felt the demonic chakra. Kimiko had never faced a Jinchuriki in combat in her life. No one in the Uzumaki's newest generation had. What little they knew about the whole concept of Jinchuriki had been theoretical knowledge passed down by Keisuke and Hayako, based on their own experiences, until the day they had met Naruto. Even then, it wasn't like he paraded his status. However, the moment the Bija chakra wave hit her, she recognized it immediately. Based on Keisuke's lectures, there was mistaking it for anything else, which meant that something had happened to Naruto. Immediately, Kimiko had departed for the source of the wave, taking in the exchanged messages between Hikari and Hatake. Apparently that little toad, Gato, had decided to backstab his employees. Big surprise. However, the most pressing matter was suppressing the demon chakra, and Kimiko knew Hatake would be handicapped by his reluctance to hurt Naruto. She had to respect that, at the very least. Which meant there was a pressing need for a Fuin user, such as herself. Rushing towards the scene of battle, Kimiko flipped her hands in strange hand seals, which, once finished, served to boost her speed substantially. She'd heard Hatake ask Hikari about the hand seals, but her clanmate had done well in keeping the clan's secret body tattoos. Every inch of their hands and feet were covered in invisible ink tattoos. Outwardly, they were perfectly normal, but when used together or individually, the slightest shifts in movement allowed them to spell out the Fuin formulas they needed for their jutsus. However, Kimiko was different. Therein lay the foundation of the Elder's decree forbidding anyone from ever emulating her. When she was younger and even more reckless, Kimiko had tried to emulate the Fuin formula used to create Jinchuriki on herself. However, without a bijou to store within her, she sought to make herself into a container for innumerable weapons, which would come at her beck and call, effectively making her into a walking arsenal. Except she had ignored the Elder's teachings regarding how incredibly dangerous it was to do such a thing. Seals weren't meant to be permanently etched on the human body, even the Jinchuriki formulas were considered last resorts. The slightest error could easily have killed her, and given that she'd done the entire process by herself at her young age, it was a miracle it hadn't. Kuchi-os, she grunted out, ignoring the flash near her hands as 5 needle-like weapons appeared. Without faltering in her step, she grasped them and continued her way towards the sound of battle, past all the running civilians and terrified thugs. She arrived in the middle of a rather remarkable scene. Naruto, or so she assumed, by process of elimination, given that he was all but unrecognizable now, was holding his ground against Zabuza, the man's partner, and Hatake. Then, in a feat of spontaneous teamwork, the three had managed to knock Naruto down. Unfortunately, that's where Hatake's professionalism ended, as he tried to reach down to his student. A minor flinch in the chakra-cloaked being's musculature informed her that it was a potentially fatal mistake. "Kakashi, move," she yelled, as she hoisted up the 5 needle-like weapons and, one by one, threw them at her future clan head with remarkable accuracy, just as the masked shinobi tackled Kakashi out of harm's way, for Naruto had shot one chakra-cloaked arm up at his teacher and nearly taken off his head, merely nicking him on the cheek instead. With unerring accuracy, her needles did their job, pinning Naruto's limbs to the ground. She winced as she heard him cry out in pain. It was her duty to protect him, not harm him. She would have to perform penance later. Her hands flipped and slid off each other as she raced through hundreds of character combinations, years of training telling her that the formulas were on the right track. Unfortunately, a simple binding seal wouldn't do at this point. She knew she would have to create a whole new one for her future clan head. Still, even a basic seal would keep him down for a little bit longer. "Kisoku Fuin," she cried out, slamming her open palm onto the pinned Naruto's back. Black lines of characters spread out over the enraged Jinchuriki, who despite the strength of Kimiko's seals continued thrashing. Neither her barrier needles nor the restraint seal would last very long at this rate. She wasted no time. Flipping over her, temporarily subdued clansman, she used her still bleeding thumb to streak another line of the red liquid along her arm, causing another series of Fuin characters to glow green. Kuchi-os, she incanted. She was distantly aware that Kakashi was calling out to her, but couldn't afford to break her attention. Instead, she snapped up her hands and caught the two glaives that appeared in the air just before she was then tackled to the side. Blinking away her disorientation, she was surprised to find Kakashi pinning her down. Instantly, her fiery temper flared. "Get off me, Hataki," she snapped. Kakashi's one good eye turned to look at her and frowned. "Is that really the right way to thank someone for saving your life?" he asked archly. Kimiko frowned and looked around, noticing that the masked Shinobi and Zabuza were quickly cutting down a trio of archers that had appeared while she wasn't looking. A quick look around her informed her that 3 arrow shafts were planted in the ground she'd occupied moments earlier. Kakashi had indeed saved her life. "Thanks," she ground out, before getting out of his grip and back to her feet. "I'll deal with Naruto-sama," she told him. "You keep Gado's dogs off my back." Kakashi stared at her silently for a moment before looking over to Zabuza and the masked shinobi, then back at her. "They're doing just fine. Considering your focus, I'm going to guess we're on a tight schedule, right? So how about you let me help you?" he asked. Kimiko glowered, but a furious howl from Naruto quickly reminded her of how pressed for time she was. If Kakashi managed to help her get the seal done as quickly as possible, then all the better. "How much do you know about seals?" she asked, readying both glaives beneath her armpits. Kakashi frowned. "More than most, less than I'd like." Well, at least he was being honest. She quickly used the blade end of one of her glaives to carve a series of symbols on the ground. "I need to make 4 of these sets around Naruto-sama," she explained quickly. "I'll take the inner circles, you deal with the outer circles. 1 inch, each stroke. Time is of the essence." She watched Kakashi study the markings, then nod. "Understood. Will I need blood or?" Kimiko shook her head. "Carving them will do just fine," she said. "Now, hurry. The barrier needles won't last for much longer, nor will my restraining seal." Without another word, both jumped into action. Inside Naruto's mindscape, Naruto was in a quandary, and he didn't mind admitting as much. First of all, he was apparently stuck in a mindless rage, destroying everything in his path with utter disregard for his safety or that of others. Secondly, he had no control over himself at the moment or a way back into his conscious mind without losing control. End of list. Small, sure, but no less messed up for it. As he stood in the middle of his sewer-esque mindscape, and it didn't escape his notice that apparently his mind was apparently no better than a tunnel conveying sewage, he reckoned he had very little time to devise a way out of his predicament before Kakashi was put into a position where he might have to do some serious damage. He grimaced. It wasn't pleasant to think about, but time enough amongst his family, short as it may be, comparatively speaking, had taught him that sometimes drastic measures had to be taken, even if you really didn't want to. And frankly, now understanding what primordial feelings were driving his conscious self at the moment, he was rather hoping someone would stop him, no matter what, before things got too out of hand. The last thing he wanted was someone else's life on his head. He still felt the phantom pain of objects piercing his extremities, but he had learned to ignore it. As far as he was concerned, it probably meant the others outside were trying to contain him. He glanced back at the Kyuubi's cage, in the distance. The beast had insinuated that this entire fiasco was the result of his emotions getting out of hand. Perhaps that was why he wasn't angrier, or more desperate. The more he fed into those emotions, the more dangerous he'd become. In a sense, he sort of understood Kimiko on a much deeper level now. He brought up his hands and looked at them. The whole incident had come as something of a wake-up call. Never before had he been out of control like this, and he hated the feeling. He hated not knowing or being able to control himself. Sure, he flew off the handle more than a few times, but then, he was temperamental like that. This, however, was different. He could be hurting his friends, his teacher, his family for all he knew. He could have killed an innocent person, and there was nothing he could do about that. It sucked. In a twisted way, he supposed he could see where the villagers were coming from, now. If he lost control like this, he was a danger to everyone. Worse yet, what if he remembered none of this, and just committed the same mistake later on? He certainly hoped it wasn't the case, but it certainly didn't stretch the imagination. He sighed explosively, scratching his head furiously as he tried to come up with a way out of this predicament. Leaning back, he rested his head on the wall. What could he do? Trying to take control again would likely result in his getting overwhelmed once more, and he wasn't about to let out the QB because he got overconfident. He eyed the dark tunnel that led back to the QB's cage. Ideally, he could just ask the damned beast to back off, but he doubted it would work. It was clear that the giant fox monster wanted out, and wasn't too shy about causing mass destruction to get his way. Wait. Something was wrong with that train of thought. Narrowing his eyes, Naruto raised his head and looked back towards the cage. Hadn't the QB mentioned something about how he wasn't the one lending the power? Hadn't the QB insinuated that it was he who was taking away the power? Rising to his feet, Naruto looked both ways down the tunnel, then down to the water. The water came from the cage, based on the way it was flowing. Did that mean the water was the QB's chakra? He groaned. He hated difficult situations like this. Give him a nice, big target and license to go nuts, and he was a happy boy. Make him think this much, and he was liable to just develop a headache. Still, his family would expect him to try, at least. He winced as his limbs flared with pain, but ignored it. Instead, he went nearer to the water and stared at it for a moment. He knew his next act would be all sorts of boneheaded, but he had no choice at this point. Getting to his knees, he tentatively brought his hand nearer to the water, and then put in a finger. It was surprisingly warm, and not at all evil. Yet, he could feel the latent power within the liquid, trying to push into him. He frowned as he realized that it did not just do so automatically. Did that mean that he needed to want it in order to use it? Well, this certainly wasn't the moment to try and figure that out. Right now, he had to put a stop to this flow, for he was certain that it was the cause of his loss of control. Now knowing that it wouldn't just force its way into him, he stepped into the water, and soon found that, despite initial appearances, it appeared waist deep. That could be a problem. Perhaps it was a reflection of how much power was flowing into him. If so, he was fast running out of ideas on how to stop it, considering that he had nothing on hand to build a dam or anything of the sort. He tried spreading his arms in a vain attempt to stop the flow of water at either side. It didn't work. The water just flowed around and under his small arms. He thought about lying sideways, but realized the water was high enough that it would just submerge him. Naruto growled. He hated this situation. How on earth was he supposed to regain control if nothing went his way? At that moment, however, he felt his lungs tighten, as though he'd been punched in the gut. Doubling over, he nearly touched the water with his face before straightening up, yet leaning on the edge of the waterway. What was that? To his surprise, he felt his stomach growing colder, despite the warm water, and slowly began realizing that the water level itself was beginning to go down. Something was halting the flow of chakra, and he was pretty sure it hadn't been him. A smile grew on his face as he realized that something on the outside was happening, and that whatever it was going to bring him back down under control. Still, as he waited and watched the water go down, the situation still stuck in his craw. He had been useless, helpless. He had no control over his own body, or any control over the QB's chakra. He had placed his family in danger, his friends and teacher too, and hadn't been able to live up to the expectations he'd raised. He clenched his fist, more angry at himself now than at the world, though Tezuna's passing still stung. He had to grow stronger and take things more seriously now. He had a lot of power at his disposal, and unless he could control it, it would inevitably harm his friends. Once more in his life, he felt something he'd felt only a few times before. He'd felt it when the other kids at the orphanage had shunned him. He'd felt it when the adults whispered mean things about him. He'd felt it when his teachers, pre-Irika, had taunted his dream of being Shinobi. He was motivated. He swore then and there that he would learn to control his power and be the very best Shinobi Konoha had ever seen. He knew he would do it, too, because he never backed on his word. That was his ninja way. Tazuna's village square. Kakashi and Kimiko breathed hard as they watched Naruto's cubified self start to calm down, the 4 strips of Fuin characters pulsing black as they seemingly choked off his Bija chakra. On the periphery, they both realized that Zabuza and his partner seemed to have kept the mercenaries at bay, but were beginning to run into endurance problems. Gado's army was nothing if not substantial. Still, Naruto had given as good as he got. Even pinned down, Kakashi's wayward student had managed to fling balls off something at them, and whatever they touched seemed to blow up. It chilled the Jounin when he realized they looked like bastardized versions of his late master's Rasengan. He eyed his female partner then. Kimiko, for all her attitude, all her whining, and so forth, had actually proven to be rather reliable in combat when her emotions weren't getting in the way. With a swiftness and grace he'd scarcely seen before, the female Uzumaki warrior had carved her symbols with the ease of years of practice, and managed to fend off her clansmen's attacks in the process. Kakashi hadn't done so bad himself, either. Despite his unfamiliarity with Fuin, he was able to carve out his symbols in quick succession, only stopping once to remember a particular stroke pattern. And fortunately for everyone involved, the seal had stuck and done its job. Kakashi. He turned to see Kimiko looking right at him. It surprised him to realize that this was the second time she'd called him by his first name. There was no warmth there, however, only suspicious anxiousness. "What happens now?" she asked warily. He could see where she was coming from, of course. His student had wreaked quite a bit of damage in his rampage, and enough people had seen him go berserk to basically let the cat out of the bag. Worst case scenario, Gado would use the attack to rally the people behind his corrupt, albeit secure administration, thereby derailing all of Tazuna's life work. "We need to find Tazuna," he said. At her confused look, he glanced over to Naruto's normalizing form. Whatever triggered this, Tazuna was involved in some way. "We need to find him, in whatever state he's in, and get the real story out there." "Before Gado gets here," Kimiko added. He nodded, pleased she'd followed his train of thought. "Exactly." She then glanced over to where Zabuza and Haku were still dealing with the mercenaries. "And them?" she asked. Her voice was ice-cold as she spoke of the 2 Mizu natives, but he could see a distinctly less impulsively hostile attitude developing. Clearly, the 2 rogue shinobi's act of staying behind and helping out had won them some points. "They get to live, and leave," he told her firmly. He saw quite the raging storm in those brown-colored eyes of hers, but when she looked away, he knew she'd conceded. Another minor miracle, it seemed. "Very well," she vocalized what he already knew. "Then I shall proceed with finding Tazuna. We must acquire the truth of these events as soon as possible, or else I fear Naruto-sama's condition will prejudice the villagers." The curled lip of disgust with which she spoke of the villagers was curious to Kakashi, but he didn't exactly have the luxury of time on his side. "No, I'll look for Tazuna," he said, pointing at his nose. "My tracking skills aren't too shabby, and I've got a pretty good tracking team on hand," he told her, using the tip of a kunai to draw blood. Kimiko stared at him, then nodded. "Very well. I will guard Naruto-sama and inform Hikari of the situation." Kakashi nodded. He had no doubts that Hikari would be worried out of her mind by now, given how much time had passed between their last communication. And to be honest, he was rather worried for his 2 injured students. Even if Naruto had taken up most of his attention, he was no less worried for his injured charges. Please make sure Hinata and Kiba are fine, he requested, relieved when Kimiko nodded. Without another word, Kakashi flipped through the appropriate hand seals and slammed a palm onto the ground, kicking up some residual dust. Kuchios, he cried out. In several puffs of smoke, Kakashi's Ninken familiars appeared, much to Kimiko's surprise. In fact, if his eyes weren't deceiving him, she'd started to develop this sort of incredibly girly look of surprised joy before her cool facade slammed back into force. Kakashi eyed his Ninken, then Kimiko, who was now looking away, and decided to file that information for later use and abuse. However, any plans to search for Tazuna immediately ended the moment they both noticed a shadow on the horizon, growing thicker and larger by the second. Belatedly, they realized what these were. Arrows. Zabuza. Run, he shouted. Fortunately, both Mizu natives seemed to realize the imminent danger and jumped out of range, even though a simple use of Zabuza's partner's ice could have shielded them. As the duo reached him and Kimiko, Kakashi cursed the horrible timing they'd been suffering these past few days, and turned to his dogs, who had wisely stayed quiet in the face of the mass devastation around them. Listen up, he said. There's an old man lying around somewhere, probably has to do with this whole mess. He may be alive, he may be hurt, he may be dead. Whatever he is, we need to find him ASAP, he told his summons. Find him, bring him back here. Before things get worse. The small pug amongst his Ninken snorted, prompting a surprised look from Kimiko. This can get worse, the dog asked skeptically. Kakashi eyed Naruto's unconscious form, then the growing mass of people converging on the plaza from all sides. So much worse, Pakken. The small pug stared at him, then at his companions, and nodded in a very human-like fashion. Right, then, he acknowledged. Keep safe, Kakashi. Without another word, the pug and his canine companions dashed away, leaving the quartet to face the oncoming wave of mercenaries, who all had murder in their eyes. And right in the middle of that crowd, looking all too pleased with himself, was Gato. Well, Zabuza, you wanted him? There he is, Kakashi joked as all four warriors tensed, Naruto's body lying motionless behind them. Funny, Hataki, deadpan Zabuza. 5 Rio says he begins monologuing. I'll take that bet, Kimiko spoke up, much to Kakashi's surprise. He supposed their imminent, shared danger was speeding along her tolerance towards the Mizu natives. Zabuza-sama, there are more coming in from behind us, the missing Nin's companion said then. A glance backwards confirmed the arrival of more mercenaries. Wherever Gato had gone during Naruto's takedown, he had really pulled out all the stops. Guess it's a party, then, Kakashi noted, slowly drawing back to cover his unconscious student. Uzumaki-san, Zabuza, Haku-san, whatever differences we've had, I'd say now's a good time to put them behind us. Zabuza chuckled as he, too, took a few steps back and joined Kakashi near the unconscious boy. Faye. Joining forces with a Konoha Nin. Never thought I'd see the day. Like Kiri is any better, Kimiko riposted, a little acidly. Even if she was willing, however reluctantly, to cooperate with Zabuza and his companion, her hatred for Mizu had just diminished, not gone away. Kakashi watched as Gato stopped his march just in front of his men, and opened his mouth. Then, just as quickly, he closed it and shrugged, raising his cane to point at the group. Next to him, Kakashi heard Zabuza curse. Fuck. Looks like I'm 5 Rio short. Kakashi chuckled, just as Gato finally gave the order. Kill them, been waiting for you. Thanks for watching. Like, subscribe, and share. Want early audio-only versions? Join me on Patreon, link in description. I'm Fox Sage, see you next time.